I will start us with a Washington Post survey that shows that the rate of sexlessness among young men has tripled in the decade leading up to 2018. What in the hell is going on?
Yeah, so that was a big kind of statistic that was flying around there. There's some new statistics actually that show that sexlessness uniquely being towards young men has actually reversed somewhat, and part of that might be that during the pandemic, young men might have been more risk-taking and they'd be more inclined to go out.
During the pandemic, they were taking bigger risks? I thought for sure that number was going to go the other way.
Right, yeah, but young men would be less kind of disgust sensitive than women, so they'd be willing to maybe take the risk, especially for sex. So that has reversed somewhat.
Why would that go up during the pandemic? Like that felt like a time where everybody was becoming more and more risk averse. So what about being isolated or clamped down on, or even just the risk of literal death made them more risk-taking?
So the sexlessness for men was going up until 2018, but now the new statistics are showing that it's not uniquely men that are sexless. The women have actually overtaken them, and that's what we're saying is might be a response to the pandemic, that women would be staying in more risk-adverse comparing to men. Men would actually go out and take the risk to have sex. But
so what I'm trying to wrap my head around is that a response to women pulling back, which then make men go harder? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think men typically will be more willing to take the risk. Women won't. There'll be fewer women who will take the risk, and more men would be willing to have sex with them. That's just one theory. The other idea could be that it's just a naturally kind of cycling back and forth, that this unique spike in sexlessness for young men wasn't any major artifact at all, and it's kind of evening out.
So if it went up, I think the stat was 28%. What's it down to now?
I can't recall the exact statistic now, but I know that it's reversed and that women have overtaken, there's more.
If you had to ballpark me, are we talking 26%, or are we back down to like 10, 12%?
I think it was around the 12% mark,
wow.
12, 15.
So yeah. it properly just completely reversed. So mating crisis over, we're good.
Not necessarily. So, I've spoken about that statistic on podcasts before as one kind of data point in what we call the larger mating crisis. But to think about it as a mating crisis, the evidence of young men reporting having sex within the last year, I don't think it's the best evidence of any phenomenon. You can still have this mating crisis with a lot of dissatisfaction with the mating market from both sexes, for men and for women. And there's still a lot of data points in that. So, for example, new Pew research showed that upwards of 30% of men just simply aren't even seeking romantic relations at all, even for casual sex. They're just backing out completely.
So help me reconcile that we went from 28% sexlessness before the pandemic to its drop back down. We don't know the exact number, but more or less reversed. But guys are pursuing sex less? I don't know how to make that make sense.
Yeah, so it's kind of just pointing to this: having sex one time within the last year isn't necessarily the greatest kind of metric.
So they've had sex once, but they're not pursuing it.
Yes.
Will you define what is then, if you think there is a mating crisis? I thought the mating crisis was people are not having sex. So we're putting that on the shelf. So if it isn't that, what is the mating crisis?
Okay, so the mating crisis can be traced back to an essay my supervisor wrote in 2016. So my supervisor is Dr. David Buss at the University of Texas at Austin, an evolutionary psychologist. And he wrote this essay saying the mating crisis among educated women. And he talks about this mismatch between women beginning to outpace men in educational settings. So he used the University of Texas at Austin as an example, where women are beginning to outpace men in education at rapid rates. It's called the Pink Campus. And I know you've had Richard Reeves on to talk to you in the podcast, and he lays out all of those statistics in his book of Boys and Men. Now, when you combine this socioeconomic success of young women in recent decades with their evolved mate preference for an equal or higher status mate, it just simply means that there's a skew in terms of the lack of eligible men that are out there. And when you have a skew in a mating market like that, so fewer eligible men for women to compete for, the market favors the scarcity. So those few men at the top that women are interested in are less willing to commit to long-term mating because they're the scarcity and it becomes a problem. So women have a double-edged sword because highly educated women are competing with highly educated women and lower educated women for the same increasingly small pool of men that they're deeming eligible. And, you see articles every week about this, talking about how women are beginning to freeze their eggs at rapid rates in response to this lack of eligible men out there. You see,
So I know you've already said it, but I think it bears, when you say eligible men, you mean women have a set of criteria on average, and given the only thing you've listed so far is college, but I'm guessing that there's going to be a broader set of things at play than that.
Yes.
But given that the women are just demolishing men in the educational realm, and that's one of the criteria that they use to determine eligibility.
Yes.
That they're narrowing the pool by being, I'm gonna say too selective. You're gonna have a problem with that, and understandably so. But from their perspective, just from a numbers game, it's too selective if you want a broad pool.
Yeah, it is just literally narrowing your pool that you can choose from and broadening the pool
willing to choose from.
Yes,
that's the thing I don't want to get lost in this conversation, just to make it nice and sticky.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, when I think about it like that, I wonder what advice would I give to a sister of mine if I had one. I don't have a sister.
The perfect follow-up question.
Right. Would I advise her, just simply lower your standards, marry a man less educated than yourself, even though you're not really sure that's what you want? I don't know if I could bring myself to give that advice. And there is some evidence that women are beginning to do this, and I think that's somewhat inevitable. So the phenomenon or the mating strategy that I described there of women tending to mate with higher status partners is called hypergamy. And you've probably heard a lot about that on internet discourse all around the place, but it's a very real phenomenon. And there is some evidence that hypergamy is in decline. Women are beginning to marry men less educated than themselves.
A little in decline or a lot in decline?
I can't remember the exact figures off my head, but a little in decline. It still tends to be the preference, but they're beginning to mate down, so to speak. But this comes with a whole host of other problems. So in those mateships where women are beginning to mate down, we see increased infidelity for both sexes, increased use of insomnia, anxiety, and depression medication among both sexes. You see a massive prevalence of intimate partner violence. There was a huge study done on 27 EU countries with over 21,000 EU women, and it showed that the woman earning more or being higher educated than her partner was a massive risk factor for all types of intimate partner violence.
Jesus.
Which is kind of a really dark finding, but it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, because in evolutionary psychology, we have something called mate retention strategies. And you have two strategies to retain your mate. You have the benefit provisioning strategy, which means you can provision your partner with so many benefits that she doesn't want to leave. She's happy to stay. She gets a lot of benefits from you. Whereas if you don't have a lot of benefits to provide, you choose the cost infliction mate retention strategy. And that's the type of inflicting costs on your partner to lower her self-esteem so she doesn't feel like she can leave you. And in the most extreme circumstances, that even includes intimate partner violence. So you might recognize that in the kind of abusive language of abusive men who might say, "Who would ever have you except me? You're lucky to have me. No one will ever have you." And you try and lower your partner's self-esteem or their sense of their own mate value so they don't leave you for someone else. And that makes sense. If you think about a man who's suddenly threatened that his wife is earning more than him, or has begun to earn more than him, or is higher educated, she's spending her time around other high status men, more high status than you. She's away from you, even just from a proximity point of view. You are at risk, a bigger risk of losing her. So it is a threat to you. So a lot of men do choose that strategy, which is a pretty dark finding, but one we maybe need to reckon with. As Richard Reeves points out, women are beginning to outpace men so starkly.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to your hypothetical sister. Mm-hmm. What are we telling her?
Yeah, I mean, it's just an artifact of the modern mating market that the sexes aren't really depending on each other as role mates in the same way. If we think even ancestrally, two of the main things that women used to rely on men for are protection, the bodyguard hypothesis, protection from other men, and protection from the hostile forces of nature. That's not really such a prescient factor anymore. And also, so protection and provisioning resources. If women are gathering their own resources, the state is protecting them as the bodyguard now for a large degree. They might choose to just go their own way kind of thing. We hear about men going their own way, but it actually might be the case that women are beginning to go their own way. And, it's just not obvious what a woman might get out of settling down. And it might just be a bleak truth we have to reckon with, that for the past number of decades, maybe centuries, women had been perhaps settling with men that they ordinarily wouldn't want out of strict economic necessity or strict monogamy norms.
Let me ask a really uncomfortable question.
Go ahead.
Were they settling for men that they didn't want, or did that change the context enough that there was just a broader pool of men that they wanted?
Yeah, I think the latter is probably more true. I don't think we had generations of women who were like, oh my God, what have I had to do? I hate my husband. I don't think that's the case. I just think we had very strict kind of, stricter lines around role mates. And it was, people were happy to kind of live in that world, There's a really good book by a psychologist called Eli Finkel called The All or Nothing Marriage. And it talks about how in recent decades we've began to put such a high stakes on our marriages that we demand them to be all things. Your partner must be sexually fulfilling to you, your best friend, help you fulfill your potential. All of it, all in one package. Whereas for most of our ancestral history, or in recent decades or recent centuries, your partner was a role mate that you chose to go through life with. There wasn't so many options to choose from in your city. You didn't have access to the whole world on a dating app to choose from. So it's a very, very evolutionary novel mating market we're in now, and one we really need to think about.
All right, so your sister now better understands the problem, but she still does not know what on earth she is supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And I know you don't have like a preset answer, but I think my whole thing in life is one ought to have a method by which they think through a difficult problem. Mm-hmm. So help her and all of the women listening right now, and guys, honestly, for that matter, that are listening. How do they think through this problem? Like, there is a thing that they need to do. And so when you talk to Richard Reeves, it's you can't leave men behind. You have to find a way to start supercharging them. And that for sure is where I come at this problem, is like, look, I am married to a woman that went from, when we got married, she was going to be a mother and she was going to raise the kids. And then we end up pivoting into our marriage, and she's now an entrepreneur doing her boss bitch thing and all that. That was like a whole thing. Like, we had to figure out how to navigate that. Not easy. But one of the things is, and people are going to hate this, but I was like, oh, word? Like, I'm going to outperform you. Like, I'm going to still be somebody that you look at with reverence. And that meant that I also had to step up my game. So it's like, I am both in need of encouraging her to become everything that she wants to be, and then absolutely making it anathema to my entire existence that I would ever say, slow down so I can lead.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, cool. If she's running faster and I want to lead, and look, I've got a whole thing. You need to be able to both lead and follow. I don't want people taking this out of context. But setting that aside for a second, we can talk about that in a minute. But if I want her to still be able to say, I have dated across or up, I have to move faster as well.
Right.
And I think that is something that is getting lost in society right now. I think there is a massive, I've heard you refer to this as, we're making the male way of moving through life like the default thing. But I don't think that's actually accurate. I think we're telling women, like, go be aggressive, go be dominant, sort of abstracting that from maleism or maleness. And we're saying to men, don't take up so much space. Don't be so aggressive. That's icky. That's toxic. And so you're masculinizing women, you're feminizing men, and now you're asking them to come together, all while an artificial womb feels like it's 6 weeks away. It's like, dude, this feels like a recipe for disaster. Yeah. So what say you?
I think you hit on some real accurate cultural forces and the kind of cultural rhetoric that's happening with the male default being what we're encouraging women to aspire to. Every week you see this article about how much better life is for women not having been straddled with a family and things like this. And it's just not clear to me that that goal is what women will want forever and always. It might be throughout their 20s, but most women are equipped with evolved psychology to want to start a family. So I'll give you some maybe folk wisdom from Mammy Costello, my mother. She raised 3 boys. She didn't have any daughters, but she told me that if she had a daughter and she was facing this problem, she would advise her, you can have it all, but not at the same time. So for women, I think that's very important, is that this boss bitch energy, paper chasing throughout your 20s is running up against a ticking clock that people are kind of reluctant to talk about because it's seen as quite sexist to highlight that women have a narrow window to get their their biological kind of needs met in terms of starting a family. That is a more time squeezed mission for women. But I really liked your idea of the aspirational viewpoint for men, is that yes, the women have had the brakes taken off them in education and the workplace, and they're killing it in a brain-based economy rather than a brawn-based economy. And yes, that makes for fewer eligible men. And yes, that sucks. That makes it harder for you. And in the 1950s, you would have found it easy to get a job and easy to get a wife. But so what? That's where you are. It's kind of, you take the Jordan Peterson kind of maxim of pick yourself up by your bootstraps, bucko. You kind of have to, you don't really have any other option. You can complain about the world and say, I wish it was different, but you're not going to slow women down now. That kind of train has run away, and nor should we. You know, there's probably so much of an economic gain out of women's liberation into the workplace that that's not going to go back. And also, just from a point of view of the amount of women that now have financial freedom to kind of not be dependent on perhaps abusive men, that's an under-acknowledged net good of women's liberation. And women I speak to talk to me about that. They say, oh, it's a great relief to no longer have, to be dependent. So that's one positive that's not often talked about. But yeah, so I think men need to be aspirational. Yes, we need to have a cultural conversation about what we can do to support them, kind of in a feminized education system, so to speak. But yeah, the aspirational is the way to go for men. And in terms of the conversation towards women, I would say Mother Costello had some good advice on think about your timing of all these things about having it all.
How does that play out? So what is have it all? Let's start with defining that.
So if we're saying have it all by today's maybe vision of success about having your own career, having a great husband and a family too, all of it in the one. And women often talk about that there's a lot of pressure to have all of these, and probably because they come up against each other at awkward times. So just at the point when women are beginning to really thrive in their careers towards the end of their 20s, that's the point when they really, really want to start a family. And, the gender pay gap is really a motherhood penalty kind of gap. And men, if they took a break from
Go into that a little bit, because I think this is super controversial.
Yeah.
But makes, as a CEO, I'll just tell you, this makes so much sense to me. Mm-hmm. So why do you call it a motherhood penalty? Why isn't it rightly understood as just a gender pay gap?
Yeah, because there's a lot of evidence, I believe in 22 specific cities in the US, this is very apparent, that women are actually even out-earning men up until the age of 29. And then it flips, because that's the precise age when women are kind of exiting the workforce necessarily if they want to have children. If men had to take time off work to have children, they would probably suffer a penalty as well. So, I'm all for doing all sorts of initiatives, make childcare easier, more support there, follow like a Scandinavian model to help people get back into work after having a family, all for that. But it's absolutely the case that women just, when they're about to really thrive in their career, and it baffles me when people speak about the gender pay gap on a very one-dimensional level. And speaking to you with your CEO hat on, you'll probably realize this. You don't want to lose the female talent you have at that age, right? Nobody does. So it's, and you see these cultural kind of corporate drivers, Morgan Stanley releasing this, report talking about how it's the rise of the she economy and how majority of working age women will be single and childless by the year 2040. And it's like, is this the vision? Is this the dream? I don't know if that's the case for most women.
So I will just tell you, this is fun talking to somebody who knows evolutionary psychology so well. From an evolutionary standpoint, I promise you that is not the vision. Just because evolution bifurcated the sexes a very long time ago and said, okay, we have to make this an incentive that the sexes will actually come together, and you're far more likely to have a child that lives long enough to have a child if you've got two parents coming together and obviously making it and then taking care of it. But I think that as you get into evolutionarily novel environments, when the rate of change from a cultural standpoint outpaces the evolutionary ability to keep up with it, like I don't know that there is we get on the other side of this and all is well. And I'm a hyper optimistic person, but as I look at this stuff, the only way that I can stay firmly like planted in the optimistic camp is when I just go, it'll work itself out somehow, right? In the, what was it, Steven Pinker? It's like, you can't look at however many thousands of years of tomorrow is better than today over and over. And of course there are blips and wars and things like that. But I mean, it's just the long arc of history has tended towards things getting better and better and better. But I don't actually see the path. And so I want to introduce an idea. I've never talked about it out loud, so I don't know how articulate I'm going to be on this, but this feels like a very important idea. We have become aware of the relation between the sexes, and we're aware of how much things can be malleable. And once you have that level of self-awareness in a world where you have the internet and ideas can spread at the speed of light, there comes this, everything is like self-referential. It's all pastiche. It's all, it's so self-aware, wink, wink, that I don't know that goes anywhere other than the cynicism of the eternally visible. God, I'm trying to put words to something. So, I grew up in the 80s. And I fell in love with filmmaking in the 80s. And the action genre of the 80s was very unself-aware. And so you could have Arnold Schwarzenegger throw a knife into a guy and it would pin him to a beam behind him and stick around, right? And you just laughed. It was so great and so unexpected. Now, if you say that line, you're saying it like with a wink because we've heard that line. And that created a downfall of cinema from my perspective. Once everything became, we're so aware, we already know how a movie's going to begin. We know that what happened, because you have so many books on like how screenplays are structured that in the middle, I'm going to ruin it for people that haven't become aware of this yet. In the middle of a story, it's called the midpoint. You're going to be as far away from how you're going to be at the end as possible. So if they have completely failed at the midpoint, guaranteed they succeed in the end, and vice versa. And so once all of that stuff is so known, you have a real problem of like having a fresh story. So once men and women both know, like, women, hypergamy is a real thing. Women use their sexuality to attract men. No matter how old a guy gets, he finds a 22-year-old attractive. Women look for status, money, access to resources. Like, it's just so known that you get what I'll call the Obama effect, which I actually learned from you. Okay. And this is a really interesting idea. So he writes his book, his memoir, and says, I read these books in order to be attractive to these different women. And then people went nuts on him. Like, oh my God, that's so misogynistic and so manipulative. It's like, but that is life. That is evolution. But now that we're all aware of it, it feels icky.
Yeah, it's almost too on the nose to do something like that, get the goal, get the girl. But that feels like such an intuitive idea for young men.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
That's what I'm saying. It's because we're now aware of it. It's like when it was, you just sort of figured it out. Like I figured it out along the way. I was very bad with women in the beginning. I learned how to play the game of seduction, of becoming sexually attractive, all of that. But I didn't think of it as a game. And so it wasn't icky. I was just like, oh, okay, this is what I have to do. Wow, I'm really beginning to understand it. But now once there's like websites, memes, it's so obvious. Now it's like, am I being manipulated because somebody's making themselves more attractive to me? It's just the tactics are so visible that cynicism seems the only outcome. And I don't know how we step back from the precipice of cynicism, where it's like, even as I say, guys, go get fucking tough. Go make money. Go figure out, making money is a proxy for, you know how to control your environment. You know how to create something of value. You know how to organize people. There's a whole list of things that go along with your ability to make money. But go make money. It's super valuable. It is not an end in itself. It is it's the great facilitator, as I call it. Anyway, make money, master your emotions, get physically strong, educate the shit out of yourself, like do all of these things, gain confidence. But now that it's like a known thing, it's like you get, it's toxic masculinity, you shouldn't do it, blah, blah, blah. Like, how do we step back from that?
Yeah, it's strange. And even like as benign self-development advice as Jordan Peterson gets framed as misogynistic. It's like, as if to develop yourself, particularly with the goal of achieving romantic success, that gets framed as misogynistic. But you touched on a very interesting point there earlier as well, about how you had to learn the game, or you had to go through the trial and error. And I was talking with my friend Chris Williamson about this, and we talked about how the mating market and the mating game is the only game in town that you don't get to practice for. It's a real baptism of fire. You have to go in there clumsily, develop yourself, figure out what works, get your heart broken, get rejected, get all of that anxiety. And people, being very anxious and risk adverse now, are not willing to do that. And even to do that is also kind of seen as, to make those mistakes along the way in the mating market, it comes with a lot of costs. And you mentioned like the Me Too era, there's potentially a lot of real costs associated with making a lot of mistakes along the way there.
So I mentioned that before we started rolling. So for people that don't know, so I married my student. It was a school for adults. But yeah, we, in another timeline, I often say that we're a Me Too story. But the reason I had brought that up, and this goes back to the same idea, is I was 24 when I met my now wife, and I was dumb. I was undereducated in life. I did not make much money at all. And yet I was able to attract her because she saw me teaching. So it was me teaching something that I knew and loved and was passionate about. She saw me at the front of a classroom. So it's like, forget what the name for that is, where when other women are paying attention to you, or when people are paying attention to you, it's a status thing. So she's seeing me. Everyone in the room is paying attention to me. I know more about anybody in the class about this thing. And so it was like a very artificial environment, but the perfect environment for a woman to find me attractive. And it's like, yeah, of course. Like, one, I want to be very clear. I made a move on exactly one student and I ended up marrying her. So this was not like a thing, but I was very aware that that was going to put me in my best light.
Yeah. And, you know, throughout recent decades and recent history, a lot of people met their partner at work. You know, both my brothers are married to or engaged to women they met at work as well. So, you know, it's not like this absolute fringe phenomenon that should be always frowned upon. And if you close that door for people to, you know, you're no longer allowed to meet a romantic partner at work, we spend all our time at work. It's like you're in proximity to people kind of with similar interests. They're going to see you hopefully shine in an industry that you belong in and should be thriving in. Of course, romance is going to blossom there. So that seems a bit of a misguided cultural idea, to just completely shut down workplace romances. I think it would be a shame if that was a complete... I mean, I believe even like Facebook or Netflix have a policy whereby it's just not allowed at work for employees to get together, which seems very strange.
It doesn't seem strange to me. Again, putting my CEO hat back on,
Right.
It seems stupid to me, but it is not strange. In a world where it's lawsuits, this, that, and the other, like, look, and this is easier for me because I'm married, but when I step into the work realm, I turn my sexuality off because I am so paranoid about somebody misreading it feeling like a power play or whatever. And again, this is one of those where I don't know how we step back from this, but you can't expect anyone, guys or girls, because you could easily, what I mean is guys typically make the first move. But even if you flipped it and said women are going to make the first move, you are still going to run into a problem where an unwanted advance is made.
Yeah.
And to your point about this is the one thing where you don't get to practice, even if you could practice it, it's also the one thing that when you make the move for real, like we're living in a time right now where that an unwanted advance is like seen as violence, like literally said that is violence.
Yeah.
And so it's like, whoa, like what, play that one out.
Yeah.
Where do you think that goes?
For sure. I think the idea of flipping the sexes there would have more legs than perhaps we might think, because although it is still making a move, men would perceive a move being made on them as much less harmful. Even sexual harassment, men perceive it as way less harmful when it's towards a man. Men perceive sexual harassment as less harmful generally towards men or women, but specifically towards men. So flipping it would be, I think, would have some legs. I think the worst, most men would probably be flattered and say...
So why don't we flip it?
I think that the desire is not there for women. I think most women want to be pursued rather than pursue men themselves. It's just that they want to be pursued by men they deem eligible or competent. And they've got this kind of avenue to repel or to kind of punitively punish men they don't deem eligible who are giving them the ick for coming on to them. Which is a shame, you know. There's a funny phenomenon because men have this sexual over-perception bias, whereby we perceive a smile from a woman as giving us sexual interest, and there's good evolutionary reasons for this. Is because our ancestors weren't the ones who missed a cue of sexual interest. It's actually like the smoke detector principle. It's better to be overly sensitive to these cues than to miss them. So we've got this over-perception bias. But meanwhile, women have got, for a whole host of reasons, they've got a strategy to kind of give soft rejection or to misrepresent romantic interests for a whole variety of interests, one of which could be wanting to feel safe, not feeling safe enough to forthrightly reject someone. So you've got these two mechanisms running into each other where women are giving this kind of ambiguous no or token resistance to romantic pursuit, and men are kind of learning from that. Combine this with their over-perception bias, and you've got a recipe kind of for disaster there. It's a strange... I think both sexes could do better to understand, engage in better cross-sex mind reading, which is something our lab is studying right now. Try to see things from the other's point of view. Learn about these biases that exist, and be more maybe forthright and clear. I do have sympathy with women who say that they're reluctant to give firm rejections to men, because I've seen some men get very aggressive even in response to rejection, which isn't very nice for a woman to have to deliver. But there's a whole host of other reasons women misrepresent romantic interest. 33% of women report to have engaged in a foodie call, which is misrepresenting romantic interest in order to dine at a man's expense.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it's pretty high, you'd think. Foodie calls are a real thing, yeah. And you imagine this drives a frustrated young man on the dating scene crazy, because I heard that the average cost of a first date in New York was $90. And it's like, wow, if you're a young man and you don't have a lot of money and you get burned with a few foodie calls, what a tinder keg for resentment towards the other sex, you know? So it's not good. You know? I don't know. I'm not saying that's very typical. That's 33% of women have engaged in a foodie call at some point. I don't know how typical it is or how often, the frequency they engage with it, but more common than maybe we thought.
That is shockingly high by what I would have guessed. But
I bet you're real happy you're married now.
Yeah, so I'm real happy that I'm married for a lot of reasons. Like when I think about, I just missed online dating. So that wasn't even a possibility. I'm trying to make sure that's true. As far as I remember, it was not a possibility when I met my wife. Shortly after we got married, it started to be like a real fringe, like, oh God, can you
Weird
believe
kind of,
cringe,
yeah.
cringe. But it wasn't an option. And so I'm very glad about that now that I hear more and more sort of what that ends up becoming in terms of creating this very interesting thing where you talked about this at the beginning, where a very small percentage of men that are quote unquote eligible, which I want to keep saying is self-defined. This is what women find attractive, but this super narrow pool, and then they become the scarce resource. I'm literally parroting back what you said at the beginning, but this is one of those things that really took me a while to understand this. So women crush not crush. They have a natural bias to want a certain subset of things. And as they move up the sort of hierarchy of performance, that the raw number of men in that begin to get smaller. But now, because of dating apps, they can find those guys, but those guys still are a small relative number. They become the thing that are pursued, which then clicks over into, and we should probably get more into evolved preferences on the sexes, because they are very, very different, robust, repeatable in study after study.
Yeah.
But guys, when they're the ones that are the coveted thing, they're not going to commit. And so now you get another brick in this wall of the mating crisis.
Absolutely, yeah. So the sociosexuality is either restricted or unrestricted, and it begins to mirror the one that's in the scarcity. So if women are in the scarcity, men are more keen to commit long term. And that's just as a crude sex ratio kind of balance. But
because they have to commit to get the girl.
Right, exactly. It's like, oh, I'll give you anything you want. There's not that many women around. I need to make sure I get one. So you mirror the sociosexuality of the other sex. But yeah, exactly right. And what online dating does as well is it exacerbates this problem, because it reduces the person down to a set of static data points. So your height, your income, or your educational level. And that really is what's weighted stronger than your personality even, which doesn't really shine through on a dating app, despite what a lot of people say. The example I always give is that dating apps don't allow a nice, charming Irish accent to compensate for being 5'7", which leads me to believe I wouldn't get on so great on dating apps. And that's true. I mean, the dating app Hinge, I heard the relationship science director talking with my friend Chris, that if women set their height preferences to 6 foot or over in America, they're reducing their mating pool down to just 18% of men. If they set it to 6'3" and over, they're reducing it down to just 3% of men. So when you're skewing the sex ratio against you like that and encouraging men to see themselves as or eligible men to see themselves as the scarcity, that's setting the deck against yourself for women, which is...
That's so interesting, because one, this whole arms race begins with height is an easy one to talk about. But looking at ladies, you'll have to forgive me, this is what it's called. It's like the female delusional calculator or female delusion calculator, something like that. So, and we did a test here at the office, and we said, all right, ladies, give me a guess. 6 foot or higher, $100,000 or dollars or above, not obese, and any ethnicity. What do you think the percentage ends up being? It's 0.35%. And they were all guessing like 15%, 20%, 30%. We're like, you are so far off. And those, like, the sort of meme in culture is like, well, that's what I should get. And that doesn't seem that crazy. But in reality, it's a ridiculously small, less than 0.5%.
Yeah. And in terms of like coming at it from an evolved mate preference point of view, the selection pressures that would have acted on female choosiness for height and formidability are that the idea of protection and ability to provision resources. It's an example of evolutionary mismatch, and it's obviously a very convenient one for me being 5'7" to talk about, but maybe it's time we let that one go,
That's hilarious. Yeah. So when going back to like, what is it that we can do about this? So what advice do you have for young people, anybody, male, female, either? Like, how do we navigate this? So guys, we know, like, you can push yourself, you can make yourself better, but for real, like, what do we do with women? Is it paint a new picture? Motherhood is rad. And is it just beating that drum? Is it, we need to socially champion people that are far more feminine and aren't stepping into a more masculine role? Like, what do we do for real?
So I'm optimistic that the pendulum for women and their drives might swing back towards the middle. Right now, it's
what they want or what society reinforces?
Both kind of things, because they'll kind of work in tandem to some extent. So it's not that long ago, it's only a number of decades that women have really had the brakes taken off them in education and the workplace, and they're beginning to kind of really shine. So it's a very novel kind of thing, and it's like the thing to do of, oh, you know, make your feminist ancestors really proud. You know, what would they think if you went to be a trad wife, stay-at-home mom? You know, it's kind of repellent, right? It's the nightmare scenario. Can't do that. But that pendulum might swing, and it might become a bit more loose, that people can choose from a variety of different options, which is good. Right now, the main option seems to be boss bitch energy, but that might cool as it becomes a little less novel that women can do this. One thing I would like to see happen, but I'm less optimistic about, is that mate preferences are very, very sensitive to what we assign status to. So you can assign status to any number of things. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that...
You mean for men or for men and women?
For men and for women. What makes there is some sex difference that physical beauty results in high status for women in a way that it doesn't necessarily for men. And kind of resources reduces in status, and strength results in status for men in a way that it doesn't for women. But status is to some degree arbitrary. So there's a really good book by an author called Will Storr called The Status Game. Really good book. And it talks about how there's this tribe and they assign status to whichever farmer in their tribe can grow the biggest yams. And that is the high status thing to do. So it kind of shows you this flexibility of status. So what I'm optimistic about...
I don't know that I agree with that.
Okay.
So, for instance, are women going to ever be prized by men for the ability to grow a big yam?
Less likely. But what I mean is the male status, what we assign status to for men, could be a bit more malleable.
Yep. But on that, one, we've already now slashed it. Now it's about men's status can be malleable. But if there was no fitness to the yam thing, do you think it would ever catch on? Like, for instance, I've heard you talk, I don't mean this word in a bad way, but I've heard you talk disparagingly about guys. If you're trying to make video games your status thing, women just do not care. And so I wouldn't pursue that angle. And I probably agree. It's like,
I think I agree with honorable exception. I think the really high status gamers, I've come to learn, can actually be kind of very successful in the mating domain, I imagine.
So I think that has to do with money and fame. I don't think it has to do with gaming.
Right, and it's a very narrow pool of those gamers that are going to reach those heights. But yeah, so the white pill I was trying to get at is that maybe we could see a world where we assign status to being a really involved stay-at-home father. But like I say, I'm less optimistic about it.
Why are you can give me either the why you have enough optimism that you say that, or why you're pessimistic that you want it to work, but you're probably, because I think that will never work.
I'm less optimistic because none of the data shows that that's what women want. There's one study that showed that just 5% of young women desire a partnership where they work full-time and their partner works part-time or not at all. So that's very kind of bleak. And that was a study of young women. So you'd think that those younger women would be more primed to say, yeah, I'm very egalitarian, I could work, and my mate could be the stay-at-home dad. So there doesn't seem to be any mate preference shift for women there. I'm optimistic or hopeful because I think involved fathers are really beneficial to families and to children. And that's something really important that we need to, as well as lionizing motherhood, we need to lionize fatherhood too, and involve.
Yes, but so men as mothers does not strike me as a winning thing. And I trust me, I hear the comments lighting on fire as I say those words. But what you're describing, I will say, is traditionally the feminine role. And the reason that I think evolution will get behind that is, from a physiological standpoint, only a mother can breastfeed and give birth, PS. And so once your evolution, you have to optimize one of the sex to carry the baby to term and then breastfeed it. And I don't think it's a mistake that evolution optimized, just like, I'm going to put all of those things in one bucket. So I'm going to optimize the female hip design for childbearing. I'm going to optimize the breast design for breastfeeding. And by the way, I'm going to optimize the brain design to care enough about this infant to be able to pick up on cues that maybe a guy doesn't pick up on. Also, PS, 15% of women have a fourth photoreceptor. Could that be tied to raising infants, that they can see different colors in their cheeks and so they can really understand? I don't know. I'm just saying that from a biological perspective, evolution has honed each of us to be good at something. And so when I think about evolved preferences, 100% culture plays into this. But again, I've heard you say that culture is downstream of biology, which I agree very much. And I don't think that an alien civilization, their culture would look anything like ours, presuming that they evolved in some different way. So if culture is downstream of biology and evolution has optimized one of us for the very tactile, early nurturing of an infant and the other for something else, which we can get into what that is in a minute. But I don't think that culturally you could try to reinforce something that goes against the biology. So to be very pointed, I don't think you can ever get culture to say a man staying at home and taking care of an infant is, of course, one-offs, 100%. But I don't think that will ever take over the physical preference. That's a terrible way to say it, but the en masse preference of women, because it doesn't have an evolutionary correlate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the way we describe it is that genes hold culture on a leash, and culture is a biological output. And ultimately, I do think you're right. The mate preference won't shift, or it won't shift very fast anyway, or in great numbers. And also just the personality inclination of males to be interested in being that involved in the home. Humans are a remarkable ape in that the male invests as much as it does, but you're right to point out that males invest far less than women do. So yeah, perhaps it is as bleak as we might think.
Yeah, I mean, I won't give myself over to bleakness just yet, but this does feel like something that, for us to get to a winning solution, people have to be able to confront the truth, the reality of how things actually are, and then we can build things that work. Okay, so this was me responding to your idea of involved fathers, and I think that's critically important. So now, from an evolutionary lens, what does an involved father look like if it's different than the picture that, not to get you in trouble, that I just painted of a more feminine role?
So the main role of fathers, outside of just the bodyguard hypothesis of protecting, is teaching, and teaching by action. So men are very good at kind of the rough and tumble and learning that way, and kind of making children feel safe kind of thing, and encouraging them to take risks and go out and learn about the world, whereas women would be more risk averse and be like, oh, don't take a risk, don't cycle your bike out in the street, come on, just very much keep safety conscious, whereas men are kind of like encouraging the child. It fortifies the child with an ability to navigate the world in a way that the safetyism of female typical parenting doesn't. So I think that's a huge one. And if we look at the current malaise of teenagers or young people, they're exactly this problem. They're safety conscious, safety is the paramount value of all values, and they just don't take risks. So that could be lacking. That could be just...
Would you call that the feminization of culture?
Perhaps, yeah. That's
Perhaps.
kind of a... Yeah, that's what...
Does it make you uneasy to say that?
A little, but just because there's such variability among men and women. But no, I think female typical parenting certainly looks like more safety oriented than male parenting.
When you say that there's so much variability, what do you mean?
It's just that a lot of women will have more male typical psychology or male typical behavior. I just hear the complaints of people saying, well, I know 10 women who are not safety oriented at all. So you always got to kind of give yourself a bit of ass cover there.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, let's address that head on. So, one, I want to be very clear, and I'm sure I speak for both of us. Women should be able to be whatever they want.
Yes.
I'm married to a woman that has chosen not to have kids. Word. I'm married to a woman that is trying to be the best entrepreneur that she can be. Word. I love it the most. Like, I'm still with this woman. I'm in awe of her. She's unbelievable. But at the same time, I'm very honest that transition was difficult. And it wasn't like, oh, okay, cool. Like, we had to really think about what that means and like, how do we, process through that? How do we position ourselves? Because I will say that I think that not having kids is a way higher risk strategy for especially women, but I think it's even a high risk strategy for men in terms of being fulfilled at the end of your life. And I think if you go into it with your eyes wide open, then you can mitigate those risks by how you structure your life, how you frame your life intellectually, how you think about it. But if you just go into it blindly, there's going to be a real problem. Anyway, I say all of that in response to, for a long time, I was very hesitant to even form a thought about how I actually thought this all should be because I was worried about the backlash. And when COVID kicked off for a whole host of reasons, I realized that I needed to start figuring out how I think through these problems, because I don't have wisdom on everything that I talk about. So sometimes I'm just like, okay, how would I process through that problem? But when I get to something like looking at what's happening in culture right now, this does seem to be like the feminization of culture. And I think that the way we should all be looking at this, and I think this is true for a lot of things, not just the male-female dichotomy. I think there's a lot of dichotomies in life. So in business, there's one between a visionary and an operator. And the solution to all of these is the thing that makes it work is the tension between the two. And you should never want for the conversion of the other. So for instance, if my wife and I had kids, I would not want for her to convert to a masculine way because, oh my God, like you're going to make them scared to take risks. No, it's going to be the tension between the two of us where you're trying to keep them safe. I'm trying to encourage them to take risks. And so between those two things, they will find their path. If it's just all masculine energy, you're going to have certain pathology on that side. If it's all feminine energy, you're going to have pathology on that side. So it's like maybe for all of human history, we've seen the pathology of too much masculine energy. Cool. I'm just saying the second you swing to the other side and it's all feminine energy, you will now get new pathology. And until we can be honest, like if guys can't admit, hey, cost inflicting strategies on your woman is evil, dude. Don't do that. That's so gross. You should be mortified. If you ever find yourself saying the words like, you could never find somebody as good as me, you're the asshole. And it's like, if we can't look at that and be like, that's grotesque, don't do that. But at the same time over here, it's like, there is going to be things that are equally problematic, like telling a guy not to be aggressive or telling guys that they need to shut up and sit down. No. If a woman wants to beat me at anything, she is going to have to outperform me, period. Facts, simple as. And like, that doesn't mean that I'm going to try to compete with everybody at every point. It's like, I'm going to have my areas, but if I'm trying to like be the best at something, I'm trying to be the best.
And you touch on a point that Jordan Peterson talks about how this kind of new experiment of sharing the work domain actually is pretty novel. For most of our ancestral history, we had different roles, different work roles for the family. And now you hear of all sorts of arguments where men complain that they're getting in trouble for debating or arguing with their female colleagues the exact same way they would with a male colleague. And it's seen as being aggressive or adversarial, but it's just male typical engagement.
It is aggressive and it is adversarial,
Right.
and step up.
And that's preferred by men, but it's no longer allowed. It's kind of framed as being aggressive or bullying if it's
Bullying,
towards female colleague.
now we've gone into judgment about whether it's good or bad. The reality is, so in a work environment, like this is something I've thought a lot about. Companies go out of business way more than they stay in business. And if you can't have a meritocracy where the best idea wins, you're done. You will go out of business. People's livelihoods will be destroyed. Any equity the person has built is destroyed. The money that they invested in the company or other people invested in the company, it's gone.
Yeah.
And so in the same way that legally companies are treated like a human, I would say that it is a life and death situation. And the only way forward is the best idea wins. And I don't care if that comes from a female intern. I don't care if it comes from a male CEO.
Yeah.
It's like, what is the best idea? And if you're a moron as a CEO, if you're a moron and you think because you're a guy, you have better ideas, the market will slap you into oblivion.
Yeah.
And if you're a woman that thinks your ideas are better because you are handling it in a more emotionally deft way, also false.
Yeah.
It's like the reality is you need to be able to get ideas out on the table. You need to be able to debate them openly without shutting the other person down. Because as much as I'm saying, yes, it is aggressive and adversarial, if you shut down amazing people, amazing thinkers, because you're so dominant, you're so aggressive that you don't know how to elicit the idea and how to elicit the feedback and how to get people to challenge your ideas, you're also dead. So it's like, you can't pretend that some women, maybe on balance, the majority of women, they have a different way of moving through the world. You need to be aware of that and all that. But at the same time, you can't soft shoe it so much that you're afraid to say, this is what I think is right. I'm going to fight for this idea. I need you to fight back. Because if you can't present a compelling argument.
Yeah, I agree. It is good to hear that kind of refreshing meritocracy kind of idea coming from you is good. Something you said got me thinking about also like the prioritizing of almost like a libertarian freedom of choice for what you want for your own life as the master value in recent decades for people.
I only have one master value, so I'm not sure where you're headed. My master value is fulfillment.
Right. Okay. But yeah, what I mean is that there used to be kind of these macro systems, or the fulfillment of having a family would find you whether you wanted it or not, kind of thing. Because it's pretty recent that we've had the emancipatory pill, right? So that's actually causing our status-striving mechanisms for women wanting status in the workplace and the freedom to not be reliant on a man, and they're able to kind of control their fertility, and they're running into that time window. So it's like this idea of, this individualism is almost run rampant, that it's like, oh yeah, whatever you want for your own life. But if so many people want that, the boss bitch, career-focused energy, suddenly you've got a macro problem of society, is a fertility crisis because of the individual choices in the market. So it's almost like before the pill, which was massively emancipatory for sure, you would organically find your way into kind of an equilibrium. You'd stumble into it. Whereas now, with complete control over fertility, almost complete control, it means you're kind of the individual choices that might be better in some way for the individual, or they might think it's better for themselves as an individual, is leading to a massive societal problem. So it's
And here we are. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. This is why I feel like this is so important is, again, just to plant a flag. I want to find the way back from the precipice. And I suppose I should define what that is in a second. I want to find the way back, but in a hyper self-aware world where everything feels manipulative, I don't know what the way back is.
Yeah.
So here's the precipice. The more you educate women, the fewer kids they have. If you stop having too many kids, society collapses. Now you'll build back. It'll be a pendulum. And I hear people say all the time that no society's ever recovered from a declining birth rate. That's just patently false. Look at what happened to London during the Black Plague. It was like the population cut in half. Still way bigger now than they were. But that is cold comfort to any one of us that only get, an 80 to 120 year lifespan, and the pendulum ain't going to swing that far in that life. So it's like you get what you get while you're alive. And the fact that, it'll bounce back in 150, 200 years, like, Jesus,
right.
That's not comforting.
The opportunity cost for, and when I talk about this fertility crisis, sometimes incur a little bit of flack of people saying, "Oh, are you telling women what to do with their bodies and things like that?" But I'll refer to statistics that 80% of childless women are involuntarily childless. That's by their own desires. So this is not me and any other culture warrior online talking about this fertility crisis and women need to fix it and do their Handmaid's Tale kind of role. This is saying, women, by your own desires, this is what you're saying is lacking. So it's not a crisis that I'm saying I'm unhappy about. It's even if we only look at women's own desires, they're having fewer children than they want.
What's your North Star? Like if you're coming up with a solution to a problem, what's your North Star?
I really don't know. I don't know the way back when especially we're met with such resistance from, is this even a thing? There are some people who are saying, ridiculous, it's not even a problem. It's racist to say it's a problem. It's all sorts of things.
How?
Apparently it's racist to say it's a problem because it's only certain demographics that are... Yeah, so they're saying, there's plenty of people being born in Africa, which I think is actually quite a racist idea because it implies... the people being born in Africa, we can just import them in and they'll be our labor force. And that seems a bit kind of icky to me, actually, from the other side of things. But yes, it's kind of like until the problem is acknowledged, I can't see... I'm still stuck there, to be honest, at trying to move the needle on that front at first. Get people to acknowledge in the mainstream. And we're beginning to get there, but it's still kind of framed as this nefarious kind of idea to bang that drum. So yeah, I'm still kind of there trying to move the needle towards acknowledgement first.
Okay, so I think with any of these things, whenever you're trying to think through a problem, this is certainly what I put on myself. You have to know what your North Star is. Where are you trying to go? What are you trying to get to? So in business, I call this the physics of progress. So the first rule of making progress is you have to know what you're trying to achieve. What is your goal? Like hyper specific. So for me, my very specific, very aggressive goal is human flourishing, which I will round to fulfillment.
Okay.
So fulfillment has a recipe, as far as I can tell, which is evolutionarily derived. So from what evolution has had to do to ensure that you had kids that had kids, you end up with the following recipe. You have to work really hard. That's important. You have to work hard. If you don't work hard, none of this, you just won't feel what you want to feel. You won't feel fulfilled. Even if you do all the following things that I'm about to say, if you don't work hard to get there, it just doesn't work psychologically. So you have to work really hard to gain a set of skills that matter to you and the group, that are exciting to you. It's got to be fun and enjoyable, that allow you to serve not only yourself, but the group. Yeah. And if you do that, if you're working your ass off to gain a set of skills that you care about towards a goal that is exciting and honorable, exciting is self-evident, honorable means that it uplifts a group as well as yourself, you will be fulfilled. Now, I think that the thing that does that hides in that is meaning and purpose. So like I'm doing this thing, I'm killing myself, I'm working so hard, but it gives my life meaning. I matter to the group. And the thing that historically gave you that made you feel like, whoa, I'm sacrificing myself, doing something that I love, but I'm sacrificing myself to a greater good is having kids. And the second you don't have kids, you don't have built-in flourishing. Now, that doesn't mean that having kids works for everybody because some people can't wrap their heads around it. They have the wrong frame of reference. It ends up being a nightmare. And having kids is unrelentingly difficult and will challenge you at every conceivable turn. And I think it was either Plato or Aristotle that said the only impossible job is raising children. You're going to break them to some degree. It just is what it is. And so, man, when I think when I meet parents, and I'm not kidding, I will say, thank you for your service. I'm not trying to be funny. I mean it. As somebody that hasn't decided not to have kids, I am very grateful to people that have decided to have kids. But what I know that my wife and I have to contend with is, especially as we get older, finding meaning and purpose in our lives without children, without being able to point to them and saying, okay, what I did mattered because they will live on beyond me. We have to really work to make sure that we're thinking about our lives in the right way so that we don't, while we're working, feel like I matter. And then as we stop working, go, I don't matter anymore. And what did I really leave behind? It's like, so my wife and I have sat down. Okay, we're not having kids. Cool. We have to think through these things. Like, how are we going to address this? And like, think about that. And so if that's our North Star, then it's like, hey, all the stuff that I'm saying about women, like, hey, you need to be thoughtful about like, what does it look like to define success as a woman? And if it's going to be boss bitch, it's like, cool, I'm totally here for that. But think through, what are the trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with guys. If you're not going to better yourself, if you're not going to push yourself to chase status and be better, or you're not going to have kids and bring a masculine influence, cool, fair enough. What's the trade-off?
And it seems like a hasty move to kind of disavow this evolutionarily present meaning-making mechanism that we've had, that, it obviously didn't work for every parent ever and always. Every parent didn't feel a great sense of meaning, but probably most did, and it probably found them. You hear lots of stories about when young parents have children, how they step up and they suddenly, men in particular, how when they're about to have a child, they can step up and really make something of themselves. It's very motivational. So it seems a very hasty thing to kind of disavow that culturally en masse, say, oh no, that's no longer going to be the greatest source of meaning for young people. That's a scary thing to just let go of without a ready-made answer in response. It's like, what are you going to do instead? Have people got a good answer? I don't know, if traveling the world and, there's a real absence of that meaning making, I think. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so I want to have on my tombstone one simple phrase: you're having a biological experience. And I'm obsessed with that because if you understand yourself and you understand the way your brain works and you understand the way the body works, then you can optimize towards fulfillment. Because what I'm saying is evolution has created that recipe, not me. I'm just trying to point out what has happened. I'm not trying to say this is what ought to have happened, just it is. And so given that you have a background in evolutionary psychology, that's a better way to say that, what are the differences between the sexes?
Differences between the sexes. So one of the biggest personality differences is the people versus things personality difference. Women tend to be more interested in people and social relationships, and men seem to be more interested in things, objects, tinkering with how they work. In terms of sexual psychology, massive differences between the sexes there. And the way we describe it is that where the sexes faced similar selection pressures throughout our ancestral environment, so then we would expect them to be the same. So we both face the problem of getting food into our body to fuel our body in the exact same way. So guess what? Men and women treat food psychologically pretty much the same. Same problems, no major asymmetry of difference between the sexes there. Sexual psychology is a radically different ballgame for women versus for men. Women have far greater obligatory parental investment. So sex is a far more risky endeavor for women, or has been ancestrally for sure. They may get pregnant, they may have to be stuck with the child, have to breastfeed that child. Infant mortality was massive throughout our ancestral history. It's a huge success story of recent decades, how much we've improved that. But it was a risky endeavor. The minimum parental investment of a man is one successful sex act, which I'm reliably told can be accomplished in a number of seconds. But, so it's a massive different ballgame. And where you have massive biological differences between the sexes, we should expect some psychological differences underpinning them. And we do find that. You find men have a massive greater desire for sexual variety and sexual frequency. My supervisor calls that the most boring replication in all of psychology now, because it's just one of the biggest effect sizes. So to put that into perspective, the effect size of the difference between men and women in terms of desire for sexual variety is about as big in magnitude as the sex difference in upper body strength between men and women. So that's a huge psychological effect. And in psychology, if we have an effect size that's small to medium, we're happy with that. We'll say, okay, we'll take that as a psychological finding. So the sex psychology differences being so huge, so robust, repeatedly replicated over and over again. We just did it actually the other week again. It's just a stark phenomenon, but it makes sense in the light of evolution when you think of the different selection pressures that would have shaped that psychology to underpin the biological differences.
Okay, so if culture is downstream of that biology and all those things that you just said are true, how do we end up with, I think it's 83% of all historically studied societies have been polygamous. Is that what you just told us? Would that have predicted that finding?
Yeah, so you see a large amount of societies being preferentially polygynous, meaning one man with multiple wives. Now, even within those societies, most mateships would have been monogamous. But it makes sense because a woman can only benefit so much. She can't benefit that much from having multiple husbands. She can only get pregnant so many times, once a year.
But wouldn't it be more resources? Like if I can get multiple guys, like word.
Perhaps, but it's harder to kind of control those men. But men can really benefit from multiple wives. So they really go to town. And you see whenever a man has this power, so Genghis Khan is the ultimate example. So the most amount of offspring born to one woman is 69 to this Russian peasant.
Startling that's true.
Startling
seems
that's true. Seems impossible, but seems nothing compared to someone like Genghis Khan, where it's estimated that 1 in 12 people are related to Genghis Khan because he sired so many offspring. Yeah, you have a similar effect in Ireland with King Niall of the 9 hostages. He apparently had so many concubines that all of us in Ireland are related to him some way. Apparently he's a very, very handsome dude. We're all kind of related to him in some way. But yeah, so there's very few polyandrous societies in the world.
That would be multiple males,
right.
Single wife.
And where you find those are predictable areas too of really, really harsh environment. So in the high mountains in Nepal. And the way that works is a family might say that they have 2 or 3 brothers, and instead of each brother finding a wife of their own and dividing up the farmland, which is quite limited, amongst 3 different families, they would say, hey, let's have fewer families, same land, all live together, and 2 brothers, invariably it's 2 brothers to promote genetic relatedness and more peace there.
Really fast before you move on, that seems insane when you talk about men want more sex than women. And just that alone, a woman having to please 2 men that both, one already wants more sex than she wants.
Yes.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Disaster, yeah. Well, polygyny is no picnic either. So I'll tell a funny story about the anthropologist Helen Fisher. She was walking along, and I always forget which tribe it was, with the Himba, maybe. But with this polygynous farmer, and he currently had 3 wives. And she was walking with him and she said, in an ideal world, how many wives would you want? And he stopped and he thought and he leaned in and said, none. He would like none, because apparently in these polygynous marriages, the sister wives poison each other's children. They're constantly fighting. It's no picnic. So not easy. But yeah, our ancestral history of polygyny is very interesting. And that got really, really bleak about 8,000 years ago, where it's estimated that at that time, 17 women reproduced for every 1 man. And what's thought to have happened there is, really, like if you look at the graphs, and maybe you can put them on screen, but you see an absolute nosedive for male effective population. So men so many men dying before getting to reproduce.
So let me say this another way. For one guy was getting 17 women pregnant on average.
Right.
And then guys were getting 0.
Our men were dying before getting a chance to reproduce, yes. So remember, this is a time of a lot of mortality, so a lot of men...
Wouldn't it have to be what I said is true? One guy, on average, was getting 17
yes.
different women pregnant.
Yes, and what happened, or what is postulated to have happened, is that this coincides with the onset of agriculture, which for the very first time allowed the most high-status male in a society to stockpile resources to such a degree that it created such massive inequality that it was better to be the fourth or fifth wife of the high
17th.
Perhaps.
I want to, perhaps either I'm misunderstanding this, or you're hedging against something that is just mathematically true. Is what I'm saying accurate?
Yes, and the other theory is that it coincided with either agriculture or chiefdoms, where you had this really, really high status guy. Now, what happened in response to that is the cultural norm of monogamy evolved. And cultures that practiced monogamy as a cultural norm created a more egalitarian distribution of mates. It meant that even the most high status man he couldn't monopolize the mates. And this gave your kind of disgruntled young men, your incels in a society, a fighting chance. And rather than being focused on causing trouble out there, status seeking, trying to find mates, competing with each other, they were focused on their family unit, and then, like you said, moving beyond the family unit to their society, and those cultures flourished. So you do see that in the ethnographic record that cultures that practiced monogamy began to flourish. And so Jordan Peterson gets in trouble for this because he says, "Oh, socially enforced monogamy," but that's a well-established finding in the literature that caused cultures to flourish.
Okay, so 2 questions. One. How do we end up getting to monogamy? So is it societally they recognize this is a problem? Mm-hmm. Is it top down or bottom up? That was really my question. And then I haven't paid close enough attention. Why does Jordan get in trouble for saying that? Like, what do they actually push back on?
Okay, so the first question is that, yes, in any society where you have this surplus population of unpartnered young men, your incels, it's called young male syndrome, and they cause a lot of trouble. And cultures throughout history had all sorts of cultural institutions to try and deal with this surplus population before even monogamy took hold as a cultural norm. You might send your surplus population of young men off on exploring adventures. You might send them off raiding war.
Because you just want to kill them off?
Well, you want not necessarily kill them off. You might find something more useful to do with them. If they're exploring, they could actually find something useful. Or if they're raiding other villages as Vikings or warriors, it's more useful to you than them just dying. But yeah, primarily, it's better than them causing trouble at home.
So, I mean, look, I'm definitely leading the witness because I know the punchline of this joke. But when you're sending, what is the reason that people go to war?
Yeah, so the main reason throughout our ancestral history is to get mates, to get brides. And there's the Yanomamo tribe in, I think, Bolivia and Venezuela. And there was an anthropologist called Napoleon Chagnon, and he was studying them. And they got into a conversation, and he asked them, "Why do you go to war?" And they all said, "To get mates, to get brides." And they asked the same question in return, "What does your civilization, what does your society go to war for?" And he said, "Things like democracy, freedom." And they all just laughed their head off at him. They couldn't believe that people would go to war for such a reason. So there's 2 reasons to gain brides like that. So your unmarried young men would go to war for that reason, or also just out of a kind of an arms race of we can't be seen to be seen as weak. If we don't go to war with the others, they might think we're easy pickings and they'll come to war with us, and they probably would. So it's kind of this constant tension. But those are the 2 main drives.
Yeah, so that is by far the most horrifying reality I think that we have to face, which is that over evolution, you start some percent. In fact, gosh, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are over what period of evolution. Because if this is only the last 8,000 years or whatever, that's a pretty short time period. So would that be evolved? Anyway, in your answer, please hit me with that. But the real question being that we have to face that at least for the last 8,000 years, the number one reason that people went to war was to steal women, which is, I mean, that's rough to look at.
And it's still used as a motivation for modern war, like even jihad. They will motivate young men That's the precise demographic they want, is young, unpartnered men. And what do they promise them? 72 virgins in the afterlife, even, or the promise of brides in this life, for sure. Even then, at a more micro level, with gang culture, a lot of young men probably get into a gang with the opportunity to get some status and get a girl. You know, they don't have many options. So it's still a very big motivating factor for men. But one of the kind of the white pill about it is that it was this cultural device for occupying your surplus population of young men. You also had the monastery, more peaceful kind of way to occupy them, things like that. But we've run out of those devices, really. War and, the monastery and things aren't the same cultural institutions they once were. But we do have the internet. And that seems to be what's pacifying modern young men from being out causing young male syndrome problems. They seem to be spending their time in front of screens and video games or online. And there's lots of problems with the online hostility that incels engage in or that. But, the other alternative might be worse. If they weren't being occupied in those virtual worlds, they might actually be causing more trouble.
Yeah. That is, it's, again, standing at the precipice, a very bleak picture of how we end up walking backwards. So to understand how we end up extracting ourselves from this problem, I need to understand why Jordan Peterson is attacked for talking about culturally enforced monogamy. If it is the thing that helps stabilize a society, what are people actually pushing back? Like, what are the words they say to him?
Yeah. So he wrote a really good essay in response to this, to his criticism, where he cites a lot of the literature where culturally enforced monogamy or socially enforced monogamy is absolutely a common reference in the literature.
Are people saying you're enslaving women? Like, what is the actual criticism?
So typical with Jordan Peterson kind of critique, it gets hyperbolic, the most extreme version of what he's saying, no sense of charitable interpretation at all. And they're kind of suggesting, yes, that he's saying we need to, really punitively enforce. And the word enforce is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. What he's referring to is just a cultural norm. And we absolutely have had and still have a strong cultural norm for monogamy. You can only book a hotel room as a couple. You can't book as a throuple. Now we live in a strongly culturally enforced monogamy. It's absolutely the main cultural script currently and has been certainly for the past number of centuries. So he's saying an uncontroversial thing, but just people are completely uncharitable, as we've seen many cases with Jordan Peterson.
Okay, let me see if I can construct the argument. So from a Steelman perspective, I'm not trying to give a cheap version of this. We have fought very long and hard as women. I assume this is the perspective it's coming from. We fought very long and hard as women to come out from under the yoke of men. And if you're trying to put this culturally enforced monogamy back on us, you're saying that we have to be tied again to men. Like, you're coming up with another reason. Like, before it was, I couldn't control my reproduction and I couldn't get a job. And so I finally fight back against all of that. And now you're coming back with, okay, well, if we couldn't do it because it was impossible to survive without a husband, now I'm going to repress you culturally and just make it the norm that you're stuck to one guy.
Yeah, that's absolutely the Steelman version of the argument. And fair enough if you want to say that. But it's this idea that a kind of free-reign libertarian sexual marketplace would return to this kind of effective polygyny, and that might not be any picnic for women either, because recent studies have shown that 1 in 3 UK men would be open to a polygynous mateship, but guess what? Women are not so keen on it. They don't really want this arrangement. So on the one hand, it sounds like monogamy is a cultural device to curtail women's sexual freedom, but you could look at it that it actually is a way to curtail the most high-status males' sexual monopolizing. So, it's you can't just look at it in one-dimensional analysis, but it's that polygyny was no picnic for anyone involved, and this idea that monogamy is just
why isn't it dope for the high status males. Like so I'm with your farmer in that I love my wife and you can't imagine how much. And even if she was just like, that would hurt my feelings, I wouldn't do it for that reason alone. But the reality is, bro, the thought of having another one of my wife, like, cause that you get pulled in a direction, which I think is amazing. I got a whole diatribe about how important I think it is that you and your spouse shape each other. But the thought of being pulled in multiple directions, because there are times where my wife believes I should be doing XYZ thing to stand up for her honor or whatever. And I'm like, but you're wrong. Like, you are acting like this is nuts. I don't think you should be acting like that. And so if I had 2 women pulling, or 3, oh my God. But if your gang is con and it's just like, look, I have a wife, I don't know, just making this up. I have a wife, and then I have 8,000 concubines. My wife is cool if I go sleep with any of them. I have no emotional obligation. You don't get to tell me I need to stand up for this, that, or the other. And like that, horrible for the 18,000 women. I understand that. But what I'm trying to figure out, if you're a sociopath and you're that guy, why is that bad for you?
I don't even think it needs to be a sociopath. I mean, if we're doing a cross-sex mind reading study now, where we're looking at men's and women's desired number of sex partners at various points throughout their lifetime, over the next month, over the next year, 6 months, 30 years, the whole lifetime. And some of the men, their desires are just crazy high. They're all saying like 100 partners a month, some of them. Like, we've got to boot them out of the study. They're too high. And even...
Wait, you boot them out of the study?
Sometimes if it's ridiculously high, like 1,000.
Kidding, or
maybe kidding or messing, or it's just a really like an unrealistic...
But I mean, you have Will Chamberlain, 10,000 women in his life. Running the math, I'm like, bro, when do you eat?
This is the point I was making. So you mentioned that, these sociopathic men. I don't necessarily even think it needs to be those sociopathic men. Like, look at any man that finds himself in a position where he can. Mick Jagger, any top-level rock star, will kind of act on that desire for sexual variety if it's socially sanctioned. So you need a socially sanctioned norm, or a cultural norm, to kind of buffer against that being a fine thing to do. You know, it's not just curtailing women's freedom. It's actually as much curtailing high status men's freedom.
Interesting. Okay. So I'm definitely not a libertarian, but, this is where things get tricky for me, because I don't want to see people hemmed in. I don't want to see people told that they can or can't do it. The tragedy of the commons is real. People are going to, if they know somebody's going to go take that resource, they're going to take it. It is what it is. You're not going to get around that. So my question becomes, it seems like wherever we end up as a society, we end up, because it is human nature, married to that contextual moment. And you either have to change human nature or the context. Nothing else will work. And that's why you're going to get into very weird moments, because as the context becomes novel and it disrupts the fitness of our evolutionary strategies, now it's that we are going to do what evolution has programmed us to do, period, end of story. And so as you create a weird context, you're going to get weird ass results.
Yeah, that's, I think you're exactly right. And that's where I focus so much of my time thinking about evolutionary mismatch, is this idea that our modern world just looks radically different from the world in response to which our psychology evolved. And that's the primary mission, is to understand what's happening with that interaction. How does our evolved psychology for mating work in an online setting, evolutionary novel. But you're not going to change human nature. We're rapidly changing cultures faster than we can keep up, and it's just the best we can do is try and keep up and understand. Never mind figure out what the best way to integrate and to live our life using it. But certainly denying our evolved nature is going to get us nowhere.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the mismatch. I'm very grateful that I dodged the Tinder bullet, because I would have used the life out of that. And when I was in my early 20s, while I was very, I am a big believer in love. But when I met my wife, I didn't think I was going to ever get married. I was very much on the train of like, cool, let's have a lot of short-term partners. Now that I understand women, I understand the game, I know how to get laid. I want to get laid as much as I can. Bad news is I'm really bad at not catching feels when I meet somebody extraordinary. And so end up falling head over heels. But when you look at the graph that shows sexlessness. And I know that maybe that's on the reverse, and it seems like something interesting is happening there. And I'm not sure I fully understand, even though we talked about it at the beginning. But anyway, on the graph, I think this same thing leading up to 2018, and then I need to update my data. But you can see where Tinder hits, and then sexlessness goes up. Because I'm guessing we're getting into the top percentage of men now monopolize. And so you get a huge number of guys that are having no sex and a small number of guys that are having a ton of sex. And that feels like a mismatch to me.
Yeah.
One, I'd love to get your take on that, but are there others?
Yeah, certainly. And like that could be seen as mismatch or almost a return to this effective polygyny. So if I've talked earlier about how we have this ancestral history of exactly that polygyny. And if you're to look at that data of the top 20% and the top 5% of men really having a lot of sexual partners, but a lot of other men appearing to be disenfranchised, that does look like an effective polygyny. So it could be a return rather than a mismatch. But yeah, it's facilitated by the online dating. Other aspects of mismatch, huge one is the control over our birth control. The pill is probably the most paradigm shifting technology for our mating psychology, or to impact our mating.
How's that not only good?
Because if we think back to those statistics about women, the involuntary childless women, 80% of childless women were involuntarily so. That's a massively high number. So what must be happening for a lot of them, and I'd refer your viewers to the documentary called Birth Gap by Stephen Shaw. It's fantastic, explores the population crisis. And he talks to women who report over and over again that they just simply left it too late to find a partner. And when you talk about this idea of women leaving it too late, you're not just talking about their fertility, their biological fertility. It just, you don't find a partner you're happy with, convince them to marry you. It doesn't all wrap itself up in a neat little bow in a handful of years if you start trying only at the age of 30. It's like a really, really squeezed time window that you're imposing on yourself. So that's, for many of those women, I would wager it's inadvertent. You know, they didn't see it panning out that way, and they just left it too late or couldn't find the right partner. So that's evolutionary novel. Dating apps are a huge one. They expose us to more potential mates in a lifetime, or in a few minutes, than we would be exposed to in a lifetime throughout our ancestral history. Now, the way that works in so many different ways, one could be romantic rejection. So I'm asked all the time, I research incels, and one thing people say to me all the time is, why do they care about the rejection so much? Why not just go on? There's plenty more fish in the sea. And ultra-rationalist, logical person could say, yes, that's right, there are plenty of more fish in the sea, just move on. But if you think about what rejection meant for most of our ancestral history, it was really costly, because there was only a couple of dozen potential mates that you might meet in your lifetime. They all kind of knew each other, so if they saw you getting rejected, your reputation takes a spike. So we're designed to be very anxious. It's meant to be very anxiety-inducing to engage in the mating market, because it going wrong could be very costly. So if we also think about dating apps, and even just in terms of big cities and university settings, exposing us to so many potential mates messes with our commitment devices. So why would we be inclined to commit to one partner when we're getting the impression that there's a limitless supply of other potential mates around? And we've got this FOMO of fear of missing out. Is there someone better? Should I keep swiping? Then you got on top of that, just the business model of the dating apps is designed to keep you in the dating room, in the swiping room, to keep you single. Why would their business model be anything else?
That's gnarly.
It's gnarly, and they talk about, designed to be deleted, but if you really think about it, they want swipers. They want people playing the dating game, and they kind of even transparently move to this. Some of their advertisement campaigns are like, it's great to be single, single and swiping. That's good for them,
Woof.
I know.
That's that one I had not thought of. I should have. That's very self-evident as you get into it. Oof. Okay, so we have these incredible mismatches. How do we, when you think about, so this is something I have to think about a lot. So we're creating a metaverse. I hate calling it that, but that'll get you close enough. And so I have to think about this a lot. Like people are now going to be able to build their identity. They're detached from the real world. They are able to get some of the faux cues and things that they might have to deal with they're getting faux cues of fitness that if they were in the real world, they would not be able to mistake. And so one of those would be like pornography, where you're getting some sort of subconscious cue that everything is well. Where does porn sit in your stack of problems?
Yeah, that's one idea, that it could be this kind of pseudo relationships. In terms of porn, there's two ways of looking at it. So the people who use porn, most men, are quite sexually active men who also simultaneously want to go out mate seeking too. But
we have data on that.
They're still. It doesn't seem to interfere with their mate seeking. Now, I'm a bit less optimistic about virtual reality, and as that gets more sophisticated and more embodied cognition of will people, and it becomes more costly to engage in the real mating market, will men just increasingly retreat? So it doesn't appear to be that it's just pornography per se, because that gets tied up with, very sexually unrestricted men use most pornography. But the idea of retreating into virtual worlds, virtual status games like video games and just online on the internet instead of mate seeking, that seems to have a bit more traction, I think. But just pornography on its own gets a bit caught up with, yes, but the problem is that also the most sexually active, people with the highest sexual desires use a lot of porn too. So it kind of loses that dulling effect. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm not yet clear if people that are very unsuccessful, are they also using porn?
Yeah, I would say that they are as like a coping kind of mechanism. But it's not clear to me that just stopping porn in isolation would encourage the mate seeking. But yeah.
That is surprising to me. So I don't know if there's data or if that's your hunch, but so what you're putting forth is that if I'm not masturbating, that doesn't mean, so I'm having pent up desire. That doesn't mean that I will go seek a natural human relationship to sort that out.
Yeah, and that's the surprising thing. We're seeing these data on men just not being motivated to seek mates, and it just could be.
What the fuck?
Yeah, right.
So you're tipping over. I'm realizing now I had a base assumption that was these guys are all masturbating furiously, and that is what placates them enough to not go out. Are you saying that's not true? So these guys do they have low? So, okay, let's get into incels. Do incels have, as just an extreme sort of end of this, just so we can cut to the chase? For people that don't know, incel, involuntary celibate, they want a partner, but they believe, rightly or wrongly, that they cannot get a partner. One of my pieces of advice to them would be stop masturbating, because that's going to apply massive amounts of biological pressure on you to go out.
Yeah.
So now I need you to help me understand how that is not true.
Incels are a tricky one. When we measured them on porn use against our non-incel single men, it was kind of virtually the same. So it's very hard to kind of find control groups for porn users, because every young man is pretty much using porn. It's hard to do those studies. But I just wrote a recent article for Aporia called The Allure of Inceldom, Why Incels Resist Ascension. And a lot of incels, it's intuitive to think, oh yes, they really want a mate, they really want a partner, and they'd do anything to go out and get it. But that's not the case. And all sorts of people talk about how incels are simply aiming too high, they need to lower their standards. But my idea is they're actually not aiming at all. And there's actually unique appeal to the incel identity that gets them hunkered down into that life and that victimhood mentality, rather than engaging with the anxiety-inducing mating market. So to be romantically successful, you need to go through a lot of anxiety. You need to go out, put yourself out there, get rejected a lot, get your heart broken, all those things.
Is there any data on people taking anti-anxiety medication and
mate seeking
success? Yeah.
I'm not familiar there, but we have data certainly that anxiety levels are very, very high among incels. and increasingly just among young men and women, more anxiety everywhere we look. But yeah, and that could be feeding into this reluctance to engage in the mating market, which is, like we say, one of the most anxiety-inducing things you can do. It's scary to put yourself out there, and the most successful romantic people are ones who are able to take rejection, to go through it. And you could say to incels, I promise you it's worth it. It's worth it to go through the other side, go through all the rejection. But that has become less obvious to me for incels as I've gone on.
So it's not obvious that going through the rejection will yield anything, or that getting in a relationship is worth the anxiety?
I think it's worth it, me personally, but it's not very easy for me to say to every incel who has faced just a lifetime of being rejected to say, yes, it's worth it. Keep rolling the dice. Keep rolling the dice. It might,
because they may actually not end up with a partner.
Or the cost may come. It may be so anxiety inducing to them that it's who am I to say push yourself through that pain, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't have the neuron for who am I to say.
Right,
which
yeah.
my audience either finds very entertaining, or I'm sure in the comments is shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I don't have that neuron. So who am I to say?
Yeah.
I am going to say this because I really want to see people thrive. And I am a big believer that the only difference between me and the level of success that I've had, whether it's in my relationships or money, is that I really believe that you can get better and that at anything, and that on the other side of in the dating market is nothing will ever give you more, not money, not success, not accolades, nothing than sharing your life with somebody that you're able to have a very high thriving relationship with. Because yes, you could be in a marriage with somebody and sharing your life with somebody you hate, and that would be a nightmare. I literally used to have a recurring nightmare about being in a loveless marriage. So I get that side. So I want to the thing that I'm grappling with in what you're saying is that if I knew that they could have a relationship on the other side of that, I'd be like, bro, it is worth it. Like just from a biological standpoint, I'm guaranteeing you that it's worth it, because the pair bonding. And look, there are realities to be faced about how many receptors do you have for vasopressin and oxytocin. If you don't have enough, then you may not experience the kind of thing that I experienced. But if you have a sufficient level of that, which I will just assume most people do, nothing will give you more ever than being somebody's number one and sharing that life together. What scares me is that some of these guys may be for real, of such low mate value that you aren't going to end up with somebody on the other side of that. And so if you're saying that there are some people that don't meet what I'll call minimum requirements, this really does suck. And you are going to have to find another path to fulfillment. But my thing is, I think most people understand where they fall on that spectrum.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. So let me rephrase what I was trying to say is, yes, I think it's worth it. And I think what's on the other side is flourishing and fulfillment that is worth all that pain. But I guess what I was trying to say when I said, oh, who am I to say, is that I was trying to understand the mindset of why that wouldn't be obvious to someone, why that wouldn't be obvious to an incel. And I began to realize that incels get a lot out of their social identity, of the victimhood identity, the common enemy of women all suck and Chad sucks. They get a rich lexicon of humorous trolling terminology. They have their sense of fraternity with their other fellow incels, a black and white rubric through which to view the world. They actually get a lot out of that identity that I'm beginning to see, compared with engaging in an anxiety-inducing mating market that, like you said, may not actually yield some positive results at all. We think it would, and it's intuitive to think, oh yeah, just roll the dice enough times, and just from a sheer numbers thing, that's probably right. But it may be so costly to do that they just say it's not worth all that pain to go through. What's another bleak idea is that encouraging incels to re-engage with the mating market, these socially anxious young men who aren't very experienced with women, very insecure, we might be careful what we wish for if they find girlfriends, because people always talk about how dangerous these sexless young men are. These incels are so dangerous. But what is really dangerous is an insecure, jealous boyfriend. That they engage in way more intimate partner violence and things like that than any sexless young man. So that's a bit of a dark kind of truth to reckon with as well, is that this might be no picnic. And like we talked about earlier, the engaging with the mating market, it's a baptism of fire. There's no training ground for it. There's just go out there into the world, make a bunch of mistakes, learn on your feet. So I guess what I was trying to say is, rather than who am I to say is it worth it, is that I can understand why an individual incel might elect to hunker down into victimhood identity and online worlds rather than engaging with the mating market they don't have much faith in. That's what I mean, I think.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
Whoa, that was dark.
I know.
Dark. Yeah. I love it because I think people have to face whatever is true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that brought up a couple things for me. One of them is frame of reference. Mm-hmm. So I am obsessed with the idea of frame of reference. So we all believe certain things about ourselves and the world, and that is your frame of reference. Mm-hmm. Now, anybody that thinks that their frame of reference just reflects objective reality, that person is a danger to themselves and others. Mm-hmm. And I really, really, really want people to distrust their emotions. And I mean, that was so much aggression, man. I want people to distrust their emotions. Nobody distrusts their emotions more than me. And so I'm saying that my success is because I distrust my emotions. So I learned a long time ago that I was only going to allow myself to do and believe that which moved me towards my goals. And so if my goal is to find love, et cetera, then I can't allow myself to believe that I'm unlovable, that I'm so low on the totem pole, nobody could ever find me attractive, worth being partnered with. While I believe that we're having a biological experience, while I believe that, mate preferences and all that stuff, like there is a lot of constraints. But I think there's also some malleability. And I would be looking at what is everything that I can tweak? What are the things that I can max out on? Yeah. What are the things I have to let go of? And I mean, look, if I am perfectly happy, and I've seen this countless times, where you get a really short guy with a super tall woman. Word, I'm all for it. I'm just saying, like, I want people to distrust that you don't think that you could be of value. There are ways that you could look at different pools of people that are going to find you attractive. Yeah. And I think that that would be a wise way to approach that problem. But you have to pierce people's frame of reference. If they are just convinced that they are unlovable, then that's the problem. The problem isn't that you can't actually find somebody. The problem is you believe you can't find somebody, and now you're not doing any of the things you would need to do to get on the other side of that. Yeah,
you touched on a lot of areas of incel typical psychology there, actually. So one is that they have a very strong external locus of control. They don't believe they can affect change in their own life at all. It's just things happen to them. It's outside forces, whether it's dating apps, feminism, whatever it is. I'm too short. External world has made it so that they're going to be a victim. So that's one thing. So trying to, when we think about maybe any interventions, cultivating that internal locus of control, that there's something you could do to affect change in your own life, that's very important. But incels lack that a lot. They do have a terminology for what you described of like that self-development of maxing. Everything is looks maxing, what is it, gesture maxing, to be very funny. Everything maxing, right? So that's one kind of way some incels look at it. And they have a very bleak terminology for the levels at which you can be an incel. So you can be at the stage of hope, cope, or rope. So hope describes feeling like, oh, there's still hope out there. I could maybe engage in looks maxing. I'll go to the gym. I'll become self-developed. I'll read a lot of books. Hoping. Some of them will say it's delusional hope. But to be romantically successful, you need to be have some level of self-delusion too. Yes. So we talk about it in terms of mating intelligence, which describes mating relevant other deception, but also mating relevant self-deception. To not pay attention to the rejection so much and to just keep looking out for the green flags.
Only do and believe that which moves you towards your goals.
Right. So that's an important part of mating intelligence. So that's hope, that incels might engage in the looks maxing. Then there's cope, which is, problematic coping mechanisms like drug taking, pornography use, drugs. And we have evidence that incels engage in a lot of problematic coping mechanisms. And then finally, the most bleak of all is the idea of rope, which is suicide as an outlet. And some of our data shows that suicidality is just so high among incels that it's really bleak to look at that data, because I'm asked all the time about incels from an extremism point of view. And it's my opinion, following the data, that extreme inceldom more typically looks like suicide rather than an act of violence towards others. And even the acts of violence towards others have been suicide by cop or something like this. It's an act of self-destruction. So incels do have this external locus of control. They don't believe they can affect change. They encourage each other to lay down and rot.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak gallows humor type language they have. So lay down and rot and take the black pill, which I'm sure you've heard of the black pill.
Yes.
It's a derivative of the red pill from the movie The Matrix, and describes a particularly bleak truth for incels to swallow, the belief that there's nothing they could do to affect change. So that's where they're kind of stuck. And even in my interviews with incels, when I talk to them, the last question I ask in every interview is, how would you know you're no longer an incel? And they talk about it, invariably, they all talk about it like as if it's like alcoholism, that they could relapse. And I say, how would you know you're no longer an incel? Would you need to get one girlfriend, two girlfriends, have sex one time? What would have to happen? And they talk about it like, no matter what, it could go back. You could go back. And, you get this sense that there's almost nothing is ever good enough for them to some degree. So they talk about having missed out irretrievably on developmental experiences like young romantic love, early 20s or late teens. There was something so pure about that type of romantic love that I'll never have access to again. Or women, once they've had Chad, they're always going to want him in a way that they'll never want you, even if you do get to marry her. And it's like, at what stage does it become, mate, like, come on, what will ever be good enough for you? One example I have is, I put up some statistic about how difficult short men find it on the mating market, and tons of data out there on that, unfortunately. But one guy waded into my Twitter comments and said, I'm 5'2", I'm married with kids. And a load of incels just piled into the comments saying, oh, your wife is probably cucking you and using you for your resources. And it's like, this guy is married with kids. And that's not good enough for you? It's like, it's just hunkered down into this victim mentality all the time, all the way down.
Yeah, frame of reference.
Exactly.
Frame of reference.
Mm-hmm.
When you can't pierce somebody's frame of reference, like, you're really in trouble. But
I think people struggle to understand incels' frame of reference of really seeing the world and believing that they never stand a chance. That's the genuine belief of many incels. It's not just this LARP. And obviously they hunker down into that victimhood identity, but they do, if you and all your social networks were reinforcing this belief, and it's what we call self-verification theory. So whether you see a cat or a lion in the mirror, you tend to want to surround yourself with people who see the same thing. It's actually frightening and more disturbing to have someone not see you the way you see yourself. So incels actually prefer if you say to them, yes, you really would struggle on the mating market, and the worst thing you could say is, oh, you could do better, come on, you could develop yourself, you could find a girlfriend, surely there's still hope. They don't like that at all. Because the little bit of hope is more scary to them than no hope. No hope means you don't have to try, you never stood a chance, it was over, it's not your fault, it's someone else's fault, you're just lost out on the genetic lottery, whatever it is, but at least the game is over. You don't have to go through the anxiety of trying. And that's why they're so resistant to other incels ascending. So ascending is the word they have for when an incel is no longer an incel. And they're very resistant to this idea because it dispels their idea that they never stood a chance. So they'll even kick an incel out of the forums if he's trying to find romantic success. Or they'll call him a fake cell if he does. So it's this coalitional psychology of forming a group that's very valuable. We're social creatures. That is a very valuable evolved need to you know, there would have to trade all of that coalitional psychology off in order to take their place in a mating market that, like you said, they're not confident they're going to do well in. They're exhausted with it, they're anxiety induced with it, and it's expensive. And they're invariably very poor. They're highly likely to be neat, not engaged in employment and education or training. And, you know, if we talked about the cost of dating, if they don't have the money, you know, and I don't want to use the term, who am I to insist, but you can understand how they would come to the conclusion, I'm out, I'm no longer trying. And it must be that they're no longer trying, because it's objectively impossible to prove someone is incapable of forming romantic relationships. That's objectively impossible to prove. But so that means it must be embraced. The identity must be embraced by the individual. But having researched it, I have a bit more sympathy or kind of understanding of how they would arrive at that conclusion and the incentive structure to stay in that identity rather than compete in the mating market.
Yeah, identity. That is the other thing that this brings up for me. It, again, just you can't allow yourself, if you want to flourish, remember my North Star, if you want to flourish, if you want to find fulfillment, you cannot allow yourself to take on an identity that holds you back, slows you down, whatever.
Yes.
Even if you're going to remove yourself from the dating market and say, you know, that's not a game that I want to play. Like, even that, I would rather see people go, you know what, like, I don't find it worth the anxiety. And so, not that I couldn't do it, it's that the amount of anxiety that I would have to face given my genetic hand, whatever,
Yes.
I'm not interested in playing that. Okay, cool. Like, at least now you're closer to the truth. Meaning, when I think about truth, I think we are all prediction machines. And the closer you get to the truth, the more able you are to accurately predict the outcome of your behaviors. So if you're saying, look, it is true for me to go confront that, it's a ton of anxiety for me to try to get better. You know, I'm 5'2", my IQ's 89, whatever. Like, you've got all these things working against you. All right. The amount of anxiety that I would have to go through in order to maximize things that are going to matter. God, it's just far too exhausting. Okay. At least you're not adding a layer of falsity to all of this. Cool. We're closer. Now you can find a path to fulfillment in a different direction.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I'm taking that one off the table because the anxiety is too high, but I know I need to find a path to fulfillment. So what is that going to be?
What incels might say in response to that is, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I'm just commiserating with my fellow incels about that predicament. And why shouldn't I do that? Don't we all deserve social allies? You know, and
100%.
they do. So the loneliness is off the charts too. And it's interesting when we looked at our data comparing.
Wait. I don't want that to be a rhetorical question. So why should I not do that? My first question then is going to be, what is your North Star? If your North Star is to have other people reinforce your negative view of yourself, then you're doing the right thing.
Yes.
But I need to hear you say, my North Star is not human flourishing. It is not fulfillment. It is not having contributed anything meaningfully to this world. It is, I want to optimize for other people telling me that I'm as big of a loser as I think I am. Cool. Now I'm done. There's nothing. Okay, cool. You've been honest about what your North Star is. I don't think it's neurochemically advantageous, but you're not lying to yourself. So I don't have any, like, there's nowhere for me to go. Okay, cool. So you've optimized for that.
I think that is exactly what a lot of incels would say, is that's where I'm at. That's all I think I can get out of life. I don't think I can
Now
get.
they've started bullshitting.
Yeah.
The second they say it's all I think I can get, it's like, okay, that's your problem. If you're being honest that that's what you're optimizing for, cool. The second you bullshit and say, I am like in this small group of people that cannot get better at anything that would lead to fulfillment, I'm perfectly fine with you taking off the table that I'm not going to pursue mating, which is devastating. Full acknowledgement of how devastating that is. But I'm just saying, don't optimize. If that really is off the table, let's say that you're horribly scarred over 95% of your body and your penis was burned off.
Yeah.
Cool. Mating is out for you. Get it. I'm not even going to waste time on that. But I would not spend time thinking to yourself that you cannot optimize for fulfillment. You still don't need to optimize for having people tell you all day that it really is as bad as you think. Don't optimize for that.
Yeah.
I get it. Why? Because Tom Bilyeu's North Star is human flourishing. As far as I can tell, evolution has given you the only recipe that's ever going to matter, which is that you have to work really hard to gain a set of skills that matter not only to you, but to the group. Cool. Now, mating is a rad way to be on that path and to
Yes.
matter and to fight and do things for a much smaller microcosm of your significant other and your kids. But it's still the same idea. I'm contributing to this micro group. So you're going to have to pick a different micro group to go contribute to. I'm very sad that you didn't get the most obvious one that nature gives us, which is the family microcosm.
Yes.
But it didn't. So anyway, I'm just saying that the second they say, oh, I couldn't optimize for something else, I can't get better at anything, false.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I tend to personally kind of agree with you, but I'm glad to hear you not demean how painful it is to lose out on feeling like you can even participate in that mating arena. Because one thing that infuriates me when a lay listener or someone who doesn't know much about this topic at all starts talking about incels and they say something like, why do they care so much about mating? And I'm like, well,
was crazy.
because we're all the result of an unbroken chain of ancestors who've solved that problem for long enough to reproduce. It's very important. We build billion-dollar industries around it in the form of dating apps, cosmetic surgery. It's big business. It's what people care about. And it is the root to a lot of human flourishing. So it really bugs me when people say, why don't they just simply care about other things? And it's like, it's not that easy. But yeah, I think I tend to agree with you. And in our paper, we talk about the two routes to responding to inceldom. So you can engage with the mating market again, and we can do maybe interventions to try and help incels re-engage with the mating market, but recognizing that might not be the route that's best for every incel at that given time. Maybe eventually, but as an alternative to that, you have to direct them towards better coping patterns or better forms of human flourishing without the mating market, which is a hard sell, but not impossible. Like you say, you need to find a different North Star or find a different vision for human flourishing. But yeah, it just bugs me when people kind of demean that psychic pain when it's like, oh yeah, oh, you can't get a mate. Why don't you simply care about other things? It's like, that's hard.
Well, so the great irony is you're 100% correct about the devastating reality that would be this thing is off the table, that evolution is giving me a screaming desire for. And so I'm going to have to find a way to shut that off, not shut it off, but I'm going to have to find a way to make other things matter more. But I can think of no tragedy greater than not trying. Like, and this goes back to my, once we develop this sort of cynical self-awareness, hope, cope, rope is already run in the opposite direction. Like even having that horrendously oversimplified thing that gives you a cool linguistic thing to hold on to, and it's clever and it's funny and gallows humor and all that, I get it. But like, I would personally, so in my marriage, we don't say the word divorce. We call it the D word. Okay. And the reason we do that is we just have to reinforce in each other that just isn't an option. It's not a path that we take. And so we take that off the table. And so we address issues. If you go, cool, I'll do hope, I'll do cope, I don't do rope. Like, rope is off the table for me. And so it's like, okay, once cope starts slipping, if rope isn't an option, then it's like, what are you going to do? What's the path around this? My wife and I played this game in our relationship, in our business, everything. No bullshit. What would it take? And when you start saying, I am going to find a path to this thing. Now, I may not be willing to do it, but it puts you in a solution-oriented mindset. Yes. To that end, I want to give you a question. I beg of you to ask this of everybody in your incel study. Would your emotional agony be diminished if you had an AI robot that felt like a real person in every way, could pass the Turing test, meaning having a conversation with them about the deepest, most intimate parts of your life is indistinguishable from somebody else, but you knew that robot was programmed to preferentially find you attractive, even if you're burned to a crisp, penis got burned off, whatever. But that robot just loves you by programming. Are you good with it? Or do you still need to think of yourself as a loser?
I think that what you described would scratch one itch for incels, the kind of the loneliness need, the sexual need potentially as well. But it wouldn't scratch the feeling like a loser itch, because there's no status afforded to men who have the best artificially intelligent girlfriend. There's no status afforded to that. So it'll scratch one itch for incels, but it won't scratch the other. It reminds me of that movie Her. Have you seen that one with the AI girlfriend? And it's just devastating to think. But that could be a dystopian kind of future.
But it's devastating for what reason? Why is Her the movie? For those that haven't seen it, maybe your answer will explain. But why is Her devastating? Because for me, it's only devastating for one reason.
Yeah. And it reminds me, a lot of people say, why can't incels just use sex workers? There's plenty of sex workers out there. But again, it'll only scratch that one itch. It won't scratch the itch of being sexually selected. Being sexually selected means you're seen as high status. How do you describe it? You've shown competence in your arena. You've shown value. You've created something. You've been chosen. And achieving romantic success is tied up with status for men in a loop. And that's just not going to be achievable by getting the best AI girlfriend.
That's interesting. So being selected as a proxy for I'm impressing other people just in general that I'm high status.
Yeah, there's an interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with Ayla on Twitter. She's like this kind of public intellectual, runs these massive surveys of sex surveys with 50,000 Twitter respondents. But she has this kind of pet theory. I think it's Ayla I heard it from. If it's not, I heard it somewhere else. That a lot of men don't crave having sex with really attractive women all that much, but they love the status it kind of affords them. The actual sex they could kind of go without, they'd be happy having sex with their looks match more. But the actual status that comes with being seen as having been able to attract an attractive woman is so seductive. I think there's something to that.
Not for me.
Yeah.
Not for me, because I'm super rich. So like I could, in theory, get very attractive women just based on that status alone. And man, in my narrow little piece of the universe, I'm also well known. So it's like recognizable to a narrow band of humanity and very wealthy. That is not interesting to me at all. For insecurity reasons. So it's like, I would much rather be with somebody I think is in my sexual market value on a lot of different dimensions, including age. If I'm honest, like the Leonardo DiCaprio thing, I'm like, bro, do you just look way better naked than I do? Which I doubt. What the fuck? Like I want to be, and my wife, God bless her cotton socks, is definitely in better shape than I am. But it's a pretty narrow band. Like I wouldn't let myself go farther, because then I would feel like out of her league. I would not like that feeling at all. So again, that doesn't resonate with me, not because I think I'm cool. The exact opposite. I have insecurities around it. And just the thought of like being with a 20 something, no way. Like that's crazy town. Even though like from a porn perspective, but like from a reality perspective, no thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting because it obviously comes through quite strongly how much you admire and love your wife. But I'm looking forward to hearing about how you make that one sell tonight when you tell her about it. I'd rather not.
Oh, no. My wife, dude, when I say that we have talked about everything. Yeah, if my wife were in her 20s, that would not... I thoroughly enjoyed my wife in her 20s when I was in my 20s too. But no, I'm very glad that we are both aging, even though I'm held to a different standard. That's still, I don't know. Like, I feel like whatever that thing is that lets old guys be with super young women, be with. I get the find them attractive. I find them attractive, but be with triggers.
That's a very mature way of looking at it. It's very refreshing to hear. But my supervisor describes it as men are cursed as they get older to be attracted to women that are never going to desire them.
Yeah.
So it's like,
oh man, when I think about the most brutal, and this will be interesting saying to, if we have any incels listening now, but they say that the worst moment for a man, and this resonates with me, is the moment that a woman finds you harmless. It's like, oh God, like I would rather be intimidating than harmless. Like, interesting. That's brutal.
Yeah. A brutal black pill, as the incels would say.
Yeah, that one is rough. Okay, so going back to Her, the reason that I found that movie rough is that in the end, he gets rejected even by the AI, who's just like, look, humans are just too boring. We can all think it like so much faster and talk to so many more people at one time. We're just going to peace out. So that's why that's rough. But when I think about AI, and look, I I'm paranoid. I don't think AI is some utopia. I don't think there are utopias. I think there are only trade-offs. But if I were an incel, I'd be like, AI, oh, word, sex robots, word.
Yeah.
And I would be at least like, it doesn't scratch all the itch.
Yeah.
I hear you. But having some of the itch scratch, like, look, my dog is not a child. I'm aware of that. I think it's as cringe when people like post.
Mom.
Yeah. Like my wife does it. I even think of myself, like my wife will refer to me in front of our dog as dad. So look, I buy into it. Like I get it. I just wouldn't post about it, but it does scratch part of that itch, and it does it enough that I'm like, this is actually a part of my strategy in terms of not having kids, is having a pet and being like, hey, this is a thing. And also, this is really controversial. I'm surprised at how negatively people respond to this. I'm not necessarily proud of the following statement, but it's real, man. It represents a real thought that I have. When AI kids become a thing and you can speed up their development, because the reason I didn't want to have kids is I can't fathom like 20 plus years, my wife becoming my number 2 or number 3 or number 4, depending on how many kids we have. It's like, that didn't strike me as a good idea for my marriage. So, but if I could have a kid where I'm like, the first 2 years, I want to go by over a weekend, because this is a non-biological entity. I can speed up its development as much as I want. So for a weekend, we'll have a 0 to 2 year old. Fine. Then I want the terrible 2s, maybe we spend a week with that just to feel like we earned it. Right. Then 3 to 7, maybe I want to slow that down, because those are some pretty magical years where they want to be around you. They've got a real personality. And then the teenage years, oh God, I can't even deal with that. So again, we reduce the entire teenage span to a week or 2 weeks, or, however much suffering we want to do. And then when they hit, 25 and they're like, oh, my parents aren't as dumb as I thought, we slow that back down. Right. So I could see that being a part of my strategy, if I'm really honest, especially if they're in learning mode. And so they really start to reflect your values and stuff. So you're like, oh my God, like this is so cool to see my ideas reflected like in a quote unquote living thing. So anyway, I just cannot, because of my frame of reference, I cannot adopt the lay down and rot mentality, and just feel like there are a lot of paths to fulfillment, not necessarily getting laid. So I hear you about there still not being sexually selected. But there are other paths.
I like your kind of white pill pushback against the dystopia that this technological future might bring. And Chris Williamson brought me on to talk about this very thing with him. We talked about this dystopian future of AI girlfriends and things like that. And one white pill that we thought about might be that incels, or sexless young men, might use a very sophisticated, artificially intelligent girlfriend. Yes, they might retreat from the mating market altogether, and this AI girlfriend might leap out of the uncanny valley and even surpass a flesh and blood girlfriend, but it wouldn't come with the status. So what they might do instead is use this AI girlfriend as a training ground. I've said a few times on the podcast now, there's no training ground for the mating market, except if you actually have a virtual reality AI, artificially intelligent girlfriend that you can practice on and improve your prospects for the real world mating market that would come with status. So maybe, and now the pushback I get on that is people say, oh, well, yeah, people don't use pornography to learn about how to be good lovers in bed, do they? And it's like, no, that's not true. But this isn't quite the same thing. It's a little bit different, I like to think. But yeah, the future of, I didn't even think about the idea of artificially intelligent kids and why that might be preferable, especially if you talk about when they begin to mirror you and you see yourself in them, because all our data show that parents invest more heavily in kids that look and behave like them, like to a massive degree. So that would be, the AI might be able to parasticize that parenting mechanism for a lot of people. And there could be advantages to it above and beyond the investment in an actual offspring.
Yeah. Look,
and Brave New World.
Yeah, I get how this is a Brave New World and probably dystopia. And it's super weird that humans rush towards it. And if this were an AI conversation, I would lean into that. But for now, full caveat for all of the like propensity for dystopia, just setting that aside for this conversation, I do find it very interesting what will happen when that comes online from an everybody perspective for sure, but certainly from an incel perspective, like, because that the status problem that you're talking about, much like it was considered just so cringe to do online dating in the beginning, and now it's just like 70% of people meet online first. So it's like, the fact that your girlfriend is AI, like, it will be super gross for 10 years or whatever. And then it will just be like, wait, you're dating a real person? That's so weird. Again, I understand the dystopia elements, but it's like, when computers have human level intelligence, and there is only, when you cut into them from a surgical perspective, they're different, but from the outside, like, you don't notice. They will feel the same. They'll find a way to make them the same weight. They'll have the same intellect. They'll effectively program them to be human-like, but you'll be able to pick the traits that match you and then adjust them as you go. Like, dude, for instance, if my wife could make minor adjustments to me, she would 100%. Like, the fact that it drives me crazy when things are inefficient. So I will leave things out because it's far more efficient for it to be sitting out. I know right where it is, right? But it drives my wife crazy. She wants everything hidden. So she would adjust me, tweak, if she could. I would do the same to her. Like, stop hiding things for the love of God. And I know it sounds funny, but like, that actually is a source of real tension in our marriage, and it has been for 22 years. Wow. So it's like, yes, I would make that go away, as would she. And so you get into these, people would just start making tweaks until it was awesome. And here's one thing: you think you want to tweak all the friction away, and then you do that, and you're like, actually, I need a little friction. And so you tweak the friction back in, and then you'd find, look, 7% friction, 93% get along is perfect. And then it's awesome.
No, I tend to agree with you. Definitely agree with you on the leaving things out for easy access. If they're hidden away, I forget that they're there. I had the exact same fights with girlfriends in my past, for sure. So I'm with you on that one. But yeah, definitely this idea of, but humans have also this biophilia, this kind of innate love of the natural.
Correct.
And one example I'll use to illustrate that is the resistance to artificial wombs and to in vitro meat. Both of which are kind of peculiar, because women in particular are resistant to the idea of an artificial womb. And that's crazy to me when I think of how many women lose their lives in childbirth, how dangerous, how costly it is for women to engage in natural childbirth. They should be the ones banging the drum for artificial wombs, so emancipatory, but they're not, because it strips them of some sort of essence. And I've ran the polls on my Twitter, actually, and I'd love to see these studies done in greater depth. But it was women in particular that was very resistant to this idea of artificial wombs, a completely safe technology, hypothetical technology. Very peculiar to me, just this biophilia, that you're in love with this natural. So maybe we'll put up more of a resistance to it than we think. The other one is in vitro meat. People find it kind of icky to eat lab meat that's cultivated in a petri dish, but they don't find it icky to actually kill and eat an animal. Remarkable. Just this.
Do you think either of those will fall as they become more prevalent?
I do think they'll fall. But
which one or both?
I would say the in vitro meat will fall faster.
Agreed.
I mean, people are even already running towards like artificial meats and stuff like that. But there is some people who still, or initially when they came on the market, people were like, would you really eat fake meat? And it's like, yes.
I personally have no pushback on that one, as long as they can figure out how you get the micronutrients of like rich soil into it, because my feeling is that will be non-trivial, and that if we're not, the meat that you eat is a product of what that meat ate. Even the same is true of vegetables. Like, it's eating something from the soil and the air, presumably. So it's like, what is it intaking? And so we'd have to be thoughtful about that. But if we can solve that problem, the meat thing I don't have a problem with, but the womb thing, that one I get. Like, that one feels like for, this actually isn't true. This is interesting. I'm peering into my own soul right now. I was going to say that I would have a problem with artificial insemination. And then I thought, well, wait a second.
Do you?
Would I? Like, if I knew I could pick, like they show me up on a screen, which, by the way, this is going to happen. They're going to be able to show you this exact sperm with this exact egg will yield this exact child. And so pick. And they give you like the option of 50 kids with different height, looks, intelligence, like personality traits, all of it. And I would do that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, embryo selection is just round the corner for sure. But yeah, and you know, you mentioned about the artificial insemination, like, you know, test tube babies. Now they're completely considered normal. You know, I remember at the time, the Catholic Church had big problems with them. They won't have a soul. They'll be all psychopathic and all this stuff. It's like, wow, what a ridiculous thing to think. They obviously seem to be normal human beings. Will the same be said about artificial womb babies down the line? It could be that we just embrace the technology pretty without much friction. But it's that idea that it strips women of this natural role. This natural
I don't think we're going to get over the womb one fast. This is obviously my biases speaking here. But when I think about that one, it does feel like, because I reacted some kind of way when, God, would this have been in the 90s, when women started going like, oh, men, what do we need men for? Like, we can take artificial insemination. We don't need guys. And I was like, ooh, like, I don't like the way that feels.
Yeah.
And if there's an artificial womb.
Yeah. Yeah. It's is it freeing women or is it
making them irrelevant?
Making them redundant. It's yeah, but this is the very evolutionary novel time we live in. While it's very emancipatory to free ourselves of the hostile forces of nature, it actually means we're not relying on each other in the ways we have for hundreds of thousands of years. It's a very strange time. Yeah.
It's a very strange time. Talk to me about how we rely on each other. Because one thing that I see happening in the dating market that makes me really sad, and as somebody who is just a huge fan of love, if you look at the other sex as your adversary, you are already in trouble.
Yes. I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's my optimistic response to when I see this kind of discourse culture of very adversarial men versus women type thing. I get very annoyed at that because we are each other's best ally. But ultimately, I just laugh in the face of it, because all those concerted efforts to get men and women to hate each other are pushing up against so many selection pressures throughout our ancestral history that are causing men and women to be equipped to love each other. You know,
we'll rebound. I've heard you say this before. We'll rebound, but there is a trifecta of books that I think should be mandatory reading. And I mean this. I'm not a big fan of everybody should do something, but this one, we should teach these in school. And they are the Gulag Archipelago, Mao, the Unknown Story, and the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And when you realize that we'll rebound, I'm with you there, but that when 100 million people are dying, that doesn't help. Like, that is not like, oh, don't worry. 100 years from now, everybody's going to be fine. Right now, though, people are dying by the millions, and I really don't want to see this happen. And so I feel like, yes, there is all this evolutionary pressure of like, no, when you cooperate, things are better. And so there'll be all these sort of neurochemical cues that will eventually get somebody to say, hey guys, I think we're approaching this the wrong way. Look at this. This will feel a lot better. People try it out and they're like, yeah, this is better. Then those people grow up and they teach their kids, hey, do this. But that's a long, slow cycle. And in the interim, things can go very, very wrong.
Yeah, and it's not a non-trivial harm, these concerted efforts to get men and women to hate each other and be adversarial, even if it doesn't have the mass effect. If I'm, more optimistic about our evolved psychology being more powerful. But yeah, you're right. It's not nice to see, and we should challenge it in the cultural conversation for sure.
So how do we begin to challenge that? How do we get people to stop seeing each other as adversaries?
I think my friend Chris Williamson talks about it, this kind of idea of the third wave of the red pill kind of thing, this idea that we need to move towards a very accurate cross-sex mind-reading psychology, so to try and educate the sexes about how the other side sees it, genuinely really grapple with that, because, you know, I think we kind of only pay lip service to that mission, really, of trying to see it as the other side sees it. And one example I'll use there to show a real failure of cross-sex mind reading is incels, when they're asked, or men in particular, are asked, is there any such thing as a female incel? Why is there no such thing as a female incel? And incels would usually say, well, Most women can go out and get some sex or some love or some relationship if they want. It might not be the sex or love that they want, but they can get some. And for incels, or for men in particular, some is always better than none. But that's not the case for women. For women, sex or relationships is very costly, or potentially very costly, cost-inflicting. So it's not like, for men, sex is like pizza. There's good pizza and there's pizza. There's no bad pizza. But for women, there really is bad pizza because it's a costly thing and they'd rather go without. So incels are using their male typical psychology to try to empathize or not empathize with their female counterparts and say, oh no, you have some rather than none. That's better. But that's only using male typical psychology. For women, that's not the case.
So is there a female version of incel? It won't be tied to maybe mate selection, but what's the thing where they want it so badly and they can't have it, and to them it's hope, cope, rope?
Maybe. I don't think it'll be an exact analog, but there will be the case of so many women who say they're struggling to find, and I know the term is a bit of a grating one for many incels, but eligible men, or men that they want to be with. So when you're left with the choice of either mate down or don't mate at all, that doesn't seem like a great luxury. Incels think that's a great luxury. They would say, I'd mate down in a minute, that would solve my problem. But that's not a solution to the problem for women, so it amounts to the same thing. And when I'm asked about where is the female incel community, there is a growing femcel community of kind of similar to incels hanging out in online forums and all that stuff.
And they're saying my problem is that I can't get sexually selected.
Yes, similar enough. But the more analogous femcel situation is kind of hidden in plain sight. It's these mainstream media articles about women being unable to find eligible men. They're more likely the involuntary single, rather. It's not the exact same thing, but the difference is you have mainstream media support and sympathy for these women. And it's, oh, men are not economically attractive enough or are not eligible enough for these women. There's no such kind of sympathy for the incel situation. So the female incel community is kind of hidden in plain sight. It's these women who can't find men to meet their standards.
Very interesting. Taking your own hypothesis, though, I'm wondering if that's the one. So you said that extreme incel behavior probably looks like suicidality. So they hate themselves. That's like their primary thing. It actually isn't misogyny. Their primary, I forget, toxic language, I think is what you called it.
Yes, that's right.
Is self-hatred.
Yes.
Okay, so what is the thing that makes women have a primary language of self-hatred? Is it I can't find eligible men? Is it I'm unlovable? Is it I'm not loved by my parents? I don't know. I'm trying to, because women are more likely, if I'm not mistaken, they're more likely to be suicidal, to attempt.
Yes.
They're less likely to complete by a lot.
Yes.
But they're more likely to be suicidal.
Yes, and more neurotic just generally everywhere.
Yeah. So is it that they just feel negative about any slight, and so it isn't specified to something like sex, and that just is where men sort of hyper respond?
Yeah. I mean, you could frame the incel problem as, we could argue that there's too much of a hyperfixation on the sexual component. These are just lonely young men who've retreated from society more broadly. They lack friendships, they lack jobs, education, they're not engaging with society.
So you're not going to find incels that are great at something.
Very few, right? And I hear some incels screaming now, watching this, saying, no, everything is correct in my life. I have a great life. And that's true for a minority. But for the most part, they seem these very disenfranchised young men, like the hikikomori in Japan. Are you familiar with the hikikomori?
Yeah, most people won't be, so please tell.
So the hikikomori, if we look at Japan over the recent decades, it describes a lost generation of young men who've just completely retreated and barely even leave their homes. And they just get food delivered, play video games all day, and don't engage with society. That could be a glimpse
Do you know why
into
it happened to the Japanese?
I'm not sure exactly why, but they're very technologically advanced, right? And with a kind of online culture. So it might be a glimpse into the future there of the idea of men hanging out in online worlds all day 20 years ago would have seemed very, very strange to us now. It doesn't seem that strange now. You can very much imagine it. So maybe Japan is just like a glimpse into the future there. With the hikikomori, and I haven't studied it too deeply, but I believe there's a massive absence of fathers in those homes. Just kind of Jordan Peterson talks about it, about the devouring mother who just wants to keep their sons safe and get them their food, don't need to leave the house, son. And the son is going to walk all over them in terms of dominating the mother from rules.
I didn't understand that. Say that again.
So if you have a father figure, I don't think there's many fathers who are going to tolerate their son staying inside, getting food delivered to the house, getting their mom to clean up after them. They're going to say, get up and go out and do something. But if you have an absence of that, the son might feel able to kind of maybe push over the single mother who wants to keep him safe as the paramount value, and safe and comfortable, and get the food delivered, clean up after him, play your games, and it's very pacifying. And that's kind of what you see as typical with the hikikomori.
Yeah, this is why I really think the friction between male and female temperaments is so necessary. So I read this book a long time ago called The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell. And he talked about how, hey, I think a big problem in society is that there are no more rituals. And because there are no coming of age rituals, you get this interminable youth where there is no moment where you take the kid out into the woods, you kick his teeth in, you circumcise him with no anesthetic, you make them kill a lion. I mean, there are some crazy coming of age rituals that have existed. And when I read that, I was like, whoa, because that very much my journey was, I grew up ultimately soft. My dad just got frustrated when I would be weak, but he didn't know how to say, hey kid, you need to toughen up, or he didn't know how to say it in a way that I could hear. He would just give up and go do something else. And what I needed was to be around people that just did not tolerate that. And so my wife certainly began that process. And then getting in business was, the market does not care.
Unforgiving. Yeah.
And it's like, you either figure it out or you don't. And so in pursuit of getting good at that, I gave myself over to reality, I guess is the right way to say it. And so the idea of the devouring mother who feeds into that is really played out in these rituals. And so in the book, The Power of Myth, I think anyway, I've read about this so many times, I can't remember which one. Let's say it was The Power of Myth. He talked about how what would happen is the night or the day, whenever this ritual happened, the son would be in with the women. And they would come and ritualistically tear him away from the mother, who either performatively or for real is like, no, don't take him. Wow. And so they would rip him away from the mother to be like, okay, that world is done. That door is closed. And then they would go do whatever. And the one that my audience will have heard me say many times is what Nelson Mandela went through, which his book, Long Walk to Freedom, is absolutely extraordinary. And in it, he talks about his coming of age ritual. I think he was 14, and they get you and like 3 or 4 other boys. They sit you down buck naked. They have you in front of the whole village. Wow. They have you sit there, legs spread, and I don't know, shaman or whatever, comes with a really sharp rock, grabs your foreskin and just lops it off. And then you have to yell a warrior's credo. I forget what it was, he says in the book. Wow. And I just thought, like, as terrifying as that is, having a moment like that where you have to go through something where you are ritualistically removed from the world of the feminine, and it's not a coincidence that they have you yell this warrior credo to shift you into, you are now different. And I need to go back and reread this, but I'm pretty sure that then what they do is they cover your entire body in mud, and then as it dries that night or the next day, I can't remember, a young woman comes in and washes it off your naked body. And I just thought, whoa, like it's so, like it's such a thing. Like you pass through this moment, and if I'm not conflating that, and it really is a young woman comes and wipes it off, there's really something that indoctrinates you into like that whole world. I don't know, man. Like I find that really interesting. And as I try to think through the problem of societal context has changed, we've become hyper aware. I don't like the way that hyper awareness makes you cynical, but I also like the way that we can refine some of these rituals. And now I'm sort of answering my own question from the very beginning of this. Like, how do we back off that precipice when we're so aware of this stuff. And I know that there are guys out there now creating these groups where they do take boys on like these hard retreats and they talk to them fucking hard in a way they probably never been talked about. Like, stop fucking crying. I don't want to hear it. I know, trust me, comments freaking out, but I'm telling you, as a boy that needed to learn, I was way in touch with my emotions. That was not the lesson I needed to learn. And so it was like, I had to also learn to have a gear of being tough as fuck. And like, you have to have that gear. If you don't have that gear, I don't care how in touch with your emotions are, life is going to be brutal in a way it does not need to be brutal if you figure out the other gear. Now, my marriage is a result of me being in touch with my emotions, being highly articulate, understanding my insecurities, all that. Very useful. But if I didn't also have this other gear, no bueno.
That's so interesting to see and to hear about those kind of archetypal motifs come through with those rituals you described, like the devouring mother. It's even echoed in the way they do the ritual. It's so interesting. But yeah, the lack of ritual, at least whatever about the character of the ritual itself, the marker of having achieved a certain stage in life, there's a complete absence of that now. There's just a delayed adolescence and kind of a, when do you do a certain thing? It's kind of, and even like the mating market, the way it works, there's no clear-cut blueprint. It's very atomized. There's no one helping you. You know, for most of our ancestral history, you would have had your friends or your family helping you form your mateships. Now it's just you and the app, very isolating, very atomized. And it's not, there's no ritual about it. Do people even set each other up on dates anymore? I don't think that's a done thing anymore. It's just very isolating.
What do you think about arranged marriages?
It's interesting when you look at them. They have like a success rate of people who fall in love more because the idea is that, well, when you didn't have that much choice and you weren't thinking, what's my way out? When you think, well, I have no way out. It's kind of like you had described with your wife. The D word is not an option. That's really not an option in an arranged marriage, so they tend to make the best out of it. So that's probably what we're finding.
Is there data that they're more successful?
There's some data, I believe, that shows they're more successful because it's just that when you reduce the other options, it's like, well, might as well make the most out of this. And I'm not going to second guess my husband's annoying habits of leaving everything out on the counter because this is my husband. And that's it, you know, so...
That's really interesting. So this was something that my wife and I came to very early, and I'm very grateful for it, was when we got together, we said, okay, the experiment we're running is, what does it look like when somebody shares a life forever? And there are going to be certain constraints that we have to put on our relationship to make sure that works. And one of them is we can't, what we call, let dust settle. So you can't just let something go that bothers you. You have to address it, and you have to come up with rules of engagement. So around me liking things to be efficient, her liking things to be tidy, we've had to come up with rules of engagement of how we navigate that thing. Also coming to understand the difference between a collision and base assumptions, which is, I think the world works like this, and difference in values. I think the world ought to work like this. Okay. And when you have a difference in base assumptions, it's like, oh, I never considered a different angle. I didn't even realize I had that base assumption. Thank you for pointing that out. Now I can adjust. And one of us is right about, you know, I had just never considered another thing. And we're moving from base assumption to value system, going from, well, this is how it is, but it's not necessarily how it ought to be. It ought to be like this. And can we change it? And so realizing when you have a conflict of values, you have a problem. And when you have a conflict of values, I understand your position. You understand my position. I can articulate your position so well that you will say the words, you understand my position perfectly, and vice versa. And I still think you're wrong. Yeah. And so now we have to have a rule of how we deal with that thing. But if you don't say there's no, and look, my wife and I have always said there are three things that we will not tolerate for a second: beating and cheating, and a loveless marriage. Okay. So you beat, you cheat, done. And then if this becomes a loveless marriage, if we can't unwind that, then of course we would exit. So, but we're doing everything that we can. Like I promised my wife, I guarantee it, I will never cheat on you, ever. I may break up with you, but I'm never going to cheat on you because that's in my control. But if I've become so unhappy or, whatever, then I would address that first. But if you don't put those confines, because as I really, again, just thinking through the initial question that we asked, like how do you back away from all this? I think you have to have confines. You have to have self-imposed limitations. And yes, I understand that some of the argument is like, oh my God, are you telling people what to do? Yes, motherfucker, I am telling you what to do. And the question, all 10 fingers are pointed at me. I'm telling myself what to do. Because why? I have a North Star, and that North Star is very definable, and it is human flourishing. And I think the way to human flourish is through the recipe of fulfillment. And the recipe of fulfillment just has limitations. And I forget where I first heard this, but your goal makes demands. And once you decide my goal is human flourishing, it makes demands. And one of those demands, as far as I can see, is there are going to be limitations put on something somewhere. Probably a lot of things.
That's kind of what I was getting at earlier about this, maybe the corrosive nature of the primary value for people being freedom and nothing being imposed upon me. You seem like the type of guy that you and your wife and your relationship, for the service of that higher goal, you're happy to accept kind of impositions on yourself and like rules and things like that, and that seems quite healthily integrated. And there seems to be a kind of a cultural resistance against that type of thing. And it's like, no, nobody should control you except you. The individual hyper individualism is.
I can actually I don't hackle at nobody should be able to control you but you. At the edges, I am not a libertarian. We need some government, but I think governments become very pathological. So you have to have a very big distrust for that. So I don't hackle at that statement a lot. But what I think gets thrown out in the baby and the bathwater is that I think people think that means you shouldn't have constraints. I'm just saying you should be able to choose your constraints.
Yes, and you seem to choose them,
And you, in my estimation, should be choosing your constraints based on what is the outcome of this situation without these constraints. And that's where I feel like we've gotten into some weird politically correct quagmire where people don't want to talk about what is true. And look, I ask my audience for a lot of grace on this. And I guess in the macro, I get it because people still watch my content. If you read the comments, not always in the micro. But I need to be able to think through these topics, and the way that we think, I mean, literally these conversations are my way of thinking through these problems. I get to say things out loud that could be horrendously terrible ideas, but if I can't say them out loud, I can't find the edges of where they work and where they stop working.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what, like, your audience has to be kind of like a family and charitable to you in terms of, latitude to think things through out loud. Dicey tightrope.
The word family. So I don't need my audience to be a family. I just don't think that's realistic. But what I do want is for them to recognize at a societal level, forget me as an individual, even forget themselves as an individual. At the societal level, if you can't talk about ideas and work through them and all collectively go, that's a terrible idea. And that's a great idea, as evidenced by the result that we get, not what sounds good, but actually yields the right result, then we won't be able to make progress towards human flourishing as a society.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But you kind of get that organically with your family members. They kind of give you that latitude to talk. They don't forget everything they knew about you when you say something wrong. It's like, oh, he said something wrong, but I know it's not exactly what he means. There's this very uncharitable kind of dynamic towards people now. The minute they make a slip up with saying something, particularly online, it's like, gotcha. That's it. That's you forever and always. It's not, we look at people in just isolation like that.
How do you deal with that? Because you're somebody who's on an academic track. The academy has become very feminized, and the feminine mode of fighting is reputation dismantling. And so you're somebody out here popping off on a podcast with a guy that's saying some crazy shit. You might say some crazy shit. How do you think about that as an academic?
Luckily, I haven't been burned by it so far. Fingers crossed. But I'm kind of lucky enough to have financial support that I don't need to kind of be so worried about, I have to get any academic job. I kind of want an academic job where I'll feel happy and secure and free to think and research the topics I want to research, talk about things the way I want to talk about them. I don't know if you heard, my supervisor, he did an episode with Joe Rogan, and he said that this year was one of the first times in like a 30-year career where he went to the dean of the university to say, I want to be able to teach sex and gender and sexuality the way I know. I need to make sure I have your backing, or I'm not going to teach it. In case if there's any complaints, I need to make sure I have your backing before I do. And he got that guarantee, and that was the first time he had ever done anything like that.
Wow.
That's a very odd thing for me to learn, because he's someone who's an absolute legend in our field, and I'm like, if he needs to get those assurances, maybe I ought to be a bit more wary. But I kind of only want to work in an academic job that I would want, and I'd never want to be one that I'm going to be completely hamstrung and not able to think about the things I want to think about or talk about the things I want to talk about.
Man, long may that continue. And speaking of the pendulum swinging back, I do feel some momentum now in the opposite direction. For a long time, that was why I didn't even really want to formulate thoughts around this stuff, because I didn't want to be incongruous. So I didn't want to believe something privately that I was unwilling to say publicly. But at the same time, it just seemed so fucking dangerous. I was like, I don't love that idea. And honestly, while I love doing the podcast, my wife asked me I'm trying to build the next Disney. Like that's my identity. My identity is not as Tony Robbins or Joe Rogan. My identity is Walt Disney. That is what I want to build. And so I've always been a little worried that I'll damage the brand, because the brand becomes a visual representation of my thoughts and feelings, which may or may not work. We are very much a mission-driven company, which is I want to empower people to live by a set of ideas that will actually lead them to human flourishing. But yeah, I've always been a little bit worried about that, but I've, for better or worse, sort of thrown that to the wind. Anyway, my wife asked me if that side of the business were to take off, would I stop doing the podcast? And I was like, yes. I would. So it's interesting. But anyway, for better or worse, I've decided that to think through these problems well myself, to be a useful conduit to society. And I think podcasts have really become this incredible mechanism by which the culture thinks through problems. Forget any one of us individually. The culture thinks through problems via podcasts, where we can think about how weird this is that a doctoral student, I get to bring him in and okay, you're studying this thing, like tell me all about it. And then the world gets to hear you do that. It's crazy.
And there is an appetite for people to watch long form conversations just between two guys. Like that's pretty cool. Like who could have saw that coming?
Yeah.
They talked about like HBO Max, the public audience has an attention span. You got to keep it. Who could have ever predicted you could sell out arenas with guys having a debate and things like that? It's remarkable. It's great. It re-engaged a whole generation with intellectual life. It's brilliant.
No, it's been cool.
Yeah.
And I'll give a shout out to Jordan Peterson, who I've had on the show a couple times. Would love to have him back again. I don't want his life. I can't fathom how many slings and arrows he's taken. At one point, he said that he was in the middle of like 10 lawsuits. I was just like, Jesus, man, like that would be exhausting at a level that I just can't fathom.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, I heard you bring up free speech. Somebody like asked you for the closing question, or like, what's a thing that you would leave people? And you said free speech.
Yeah.
I was shocked by that. What are your thoughts on free speech?
Yeah, it's just something that I think people don't appreciate as a master value enough. It's the only mechanism through which you can kind of self-correct yourself as a society. I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question. You need to. Who said that? Good. I don't remember, but it's a good one. But that's exactly the way I feel. But I think free speech as a value, like kind of people give lip service to it, but they really don't mean it. And I think we really need to re-engage that part of ourselves like as a core value in the social fabric. It's a huge master value that needs to be respected.
I agree. Speaking of things you can't question, evolutionary psychology comes under attack a lot. I don't understand why. It seems so self-evident to me. Why does it? What is people's beef with evolutionary psychology?
I think a lot of that can be described with the naturalistic fallacy. So that's where the belief that because some of our findings grapple with finding dark aspects of human nature, that what we're saying is natural is seen as to say that that's good.
You're justifying it.
Justifying it. And that's precisely the opposite. the only way you can overcome some of the dark aspects of your nature. So, like Darwin talked about the hostile forces of nature, there's a lot of hostile forces of our own human nature that we need to overcome. And we do it all the time. Like physical violence, we have instincts for those that we overcome all the time. But you need to be able to understand them. And there's no point in burying your head in the sand. So I think that a lot of people have that criticism. I think also people are becoming increasingly resistant to sex differences because they see some as being demeaning to others. I don't really know why. I can't fully explain everything that's going on in the full resistance to sex differences, but there is this cultural drive to pretend that men and women are the same and treat them the same. But
Do you think they're pretending?
A little
or do
bit.
they really believe it?
So it was very interesting. My supervisor wrote a book called When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment and Assault. And in one of the chapters where he talks about sex differences, he tops the chapter with a quote from the intersectional feminist Kimberly Crenshaw and says, when you treat different things the same, and that's not a recipe for equality. That's the same as oppression, is treating different things the exact same. So if you treat men and women the exact same and pretend there are no differences between them, that's actually oppressive, and often to women. So one example I'll use is the reasonable person standard for sexual crimes. So I mentioned earlier in the episode that men perceive sexual harassment and stalking and crimes of this nature as far less harmful than women do. So when we have a legal system that relies on a reasonable person standard, it very much matters whether that reasonable person is a reasonable woman or a reasonable man. So that's just a very kind of a thought experiment to think, whoa, actually sex differences could have a huge function here. We maybe shouldn't consider things as the same. We're not just completely exactly the same. So that's an interesting way to look at it.
Really powerful. This is something that I come around to in my marriage all the time. And I'm telling my wife constantly, you're judging my behavior based on what it would mean if you did it. It isn't what it means when I do it. And so you have to be really careful, to your earlier point about theory of mind and like trying to get into the other person's mind and figure out, okay, what does it mean when a guy does it or a girl does it? And so, yeah, I'll go back to this idea of boys and girls.
Yeah.
We're all prediction engines. And you are closer to the truth when you can more accurately predict the outcome of your behaviors. When I view my wife as thinking the way that I think, she confuses the life out of me. And I'm like, why are you responding like that? That doesn't make any sense. When I think of her as a more typical woman, then it's like, oh, I get it. Yes. Okay, from your frame of reference, you're going to respond like that very predictably. Got it. Understood. And that, like, in just trying to alleviate the suffering of other people, I'm like, you will do yourself a great service if you come to understand at the individual level, there's always going to be surprises. 100%. These are bell curves, the difference between men and women. Bell curves, we have more in common than we have different. But if you don't understand where the bell curves begin to diverge, you will be very confused, especially on any metric where you're towards the end of the bell curve. So if you're towards the one end of the bell curve on a trait, let's say sexual desire. So you're towards the high end of male sexual desire, just massive drive, and your significant other is on the low end of the female spectrum for sexual desire. Now it's like, she's so far lower than the lowest man that it's like, bro, you're so much farther high than the highest woman. She's so much farther low than the lowest man. That is, you better understand the differences. Otherwise, you will take it personally, if nothing else.
That's literally what our lab is focusing on researching now, is this cross-sex theory of mind. How accurate or inaccurate is each sex about these massive sexual psychology differences in sexual desires, in perception of the cost of sexual harm, things like that. And a more accurate cross-sex theory of mind is the first step to reducing sexual conflict, because there are so many examples. It's why men send dick pics and think, because they would love to receive such a picture themselves, they think maybe a woman would like it.
Baby, if you're listening, I would love it if you took pictures of your lovely bits and just sent them to me in a nonstop barrage.
There's a funny article, some BuzzFeed journalist actually tried to do this experiment. She said she was going to have revenge on all the men who send her dick pics and just put pussy pics in return.
Talk about a failure to cross-sex mind read.
Exactly.
Guys would be like, bring it on.
Yes, but there are also some other dark
hilarious.
examples of failures of cross-sex mind reading. So, do you remember Brock Turner, the swimmer athlete that raped this girl behind a dumpster, and two guys stopped him, and his father said, "Oh, but he only." Why should he have to sacrifice his whole future? The whole thing only lasted about 20 seconds.
Oh, God.
And it's like, oh, wow, what a failure of cross-sex mind reading. There's other examples of a Texas governor, I believe, or some politician, where he said, if a woman is getting raped and she can't get out of it, she might as well just lay back and enjoy it. And all of these things are like extreme examples of massive failures of cross-sex mind reading. That if you understood how bad that is for the woman, you would never be able.
That's bad for
That's
a
pretty
man.
bad, even
Like,
for a man, right?
Yeah, because if I'm
Yeah.
getting raped and the guy's like, well, you can't get out of it, bro. You might as well lay back. What the fuck are you talking about?
Exactly, yeah. So these are extreme examples, but there is some level of this at play of the ineffability or inaccessibility of the other's exact sexual psychology, but we can educate ourselves about that and try to bridge that gap.
Jesus.
Yeah.
All right. How can people follow you and bridge more of these gaps?
Great. Well, like most academics, I spend far too much time on Twitter. So my handle is at Costello William, and that's where you'll be able to keep track of most of the stuff I've got going on. I'll post about it plenty.
I love it. All right, everybody. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you want to know what it means to be a real man, be sure to watch this episode with Chris Williamson.
Masculinity has a very difficult place to stand in 2023, to be able to find a place which is both aspirational for young men to look up to and also acceptable publicly. That seems to be